I shall be crowned king. Greetings, fellow multiversal adventurers. It's an honor to have you back in this saga that has us all hooked. Official channel statement: this story is 100% epic fiction. So please don't attempt real magic, the results aren't guaranteed and insurance won't cover it. The rights to this masterpiece belong entirely to its brilliant original author. We are just a barge sharing it with you. Do you want to keep being part of this amazing community? Join our ninja army of subscribers on YouTube and give this content a like. And for true fans, our Patreon has exclusive ninjutsu waiting for you. Chapter 51: The Final Plan. The main fortress, 5th floor, top floor. Pitch black, especially in the corridors, over 100 soldiers huddled against the walls, facing each other in pairs, hiding behind tightly sealed wooden doors, trembling as they clutch their rifles, their eyes wide in the darkness, like rats hiding in a burrow. Outside the wooden doors, the sounds of battle roared, mingled with the torrential rain and screams of agony. Below the stairs lurked some unknown darkness, strictly forbidden to enter, and they were the rats caught between the two, temporarily clinging to life. Rats! Looking at the expressions of terror on their faces at the slightest movement in the dark corridor, Carl Bain couldn't help but sigh. In his short but memorable military career, no battle had ever been as agonizing as this. It was as if, from the moment he bumped into Anson Bach during that foggy retreat, the whole world had changed. The jokes in the taverns, the rumors in the camps, suddenly appeared so real before his eyes. Carl, a cheap cigarette dangling from his lips, fumbled for his matchbox, but frantically couldn't find it. Snap! A sudden flash of light in the darkness drew the attention of most of the soldiers in the corridor. The tiny flame trembled as it approached the cigarette butt near Carl's mouth, accompanied by a puff of acrid smoke, the burning tobacco glowing a pale yet alluring golden red. "Captain Carl Bain," the soldier holding the match said cautiously, watching Carl puff away. "You mean, we really aren't going down? What is it?" Carl, somewhat impatient, looked at the doubtful soldier, acknowledging that the other had lit his cigarette. "Nothing. I feel like this is a bit dangerous." The soldier pursed his lips, his expression somewhat strange. "Why are we left here? I mean, if it's really dangerous down there, or, soldier. I've been in Clovis's army for many years, fought in over a dozen battles, big and small, won and lost. Want to know the secret to how I've survived to this day, to becoming a captain?" Interrupted and sprayed with smoke by Carl, the soldier nodded repeatedly, suppressing a cough. "Just one." Carl held up his index finger at him. "Don't say I feel a vanguard like you will always be the first to die." The frightened soldier shuddered, and the surrounding gazes all averted from Carl's eyes. "When did you join the 1st Legion?" Seeing the other soldier's startled expression, Carl, with a cigarette dangling from his lips, smiled. "The day of the cavalry raid, or the day we were building the artillery fortifications?" "The day we were building the fortifications, I came with the cannons," the soldier answered truthfully, a hint of pride in his voice. "The foundry that cast these cannons is near my home. I even worked as a porter in their workshop." "Ah, no wonder then." Carl nodded, then looked at the soldier seriously. "Listen carefully, kid. I don't know why you joined the army, but remember, the most important thing in an army isn't winning big battles, or killing the enemy, it's surviving. As a soldier, you must steadfastly follow your commander, and at the same time do everything possible to ensure that both you and your commander survive. That way, you may sometimes lose, sometimes win, but as long as you're alive, you still have a chance to lose, unlike those dead conquerors, who truly had no chance to win, and very fortunately, you've encountered a very special officer, Anson Bach. This guy is like a madman, and the plans he devises are more insane than the last, but every time, the bloody truth tells me that his methods are the only way to survive." Carl coughed twice, as if choked by smoke, his gaze unusually lost in thought. "Every time you think he's gone mad, deliberately courting death or even dragging everyone down with him, you never know how much preparation and consideration he's made behind those seemingly crazy plans. When the main force has already fled, he can get a bunch of soldiers who are almost paralyzed with fear to hold their ground and defeat 3 times their number of enemies. He even managed to change the mind of the commander who wanted to execute him, getting thousands of men to fight according to the plan of his supervising adjutant. So no matter what you think, you must carry out his orders properly and make this battle proceed as he plans, because only in this way is your best chance of survival. Also, I am not his adjutant." Looking at Carl's righteous and stern expression, the soldier was somewhat confused. "But I didn't ask that." "Huh?" Carl paused, staring at the soldier with a bewildered expression, cigarette between his fingers. The soldier nodded innocently, completely unaware of his meaning. Carl pondered for a moment, then turned his head and took a deep drag on his cigarette. I was just reminding you, in case you actually asked. What's most important for a plan? Foresight? Targetedness? Feasibility? Constraints? Anson believed each of these was important, but every time he formulated a plan, he would obsessively force himself to create another illusion that the plan would completely fail. What should he do then? Give up and die? That wasn't his style. Always have a backup plan, always think about how to fight for a chance of survival in the most utterly crushing defeat, if you were killed, wiped out. Like a competent copywriter, one must always be prepared to face the client's wild ideas, the boss's unreasonable demands, and the colleague's relentless blame shifting. After being repeatedly pushed back to the starting point, one must calmly begin the next round of repetition, persevering and unyielding. Bloodline power was Anson's backup plan. After learning ample information about bloodline power from Louis Bernard and conducting sufficient trials, Anson could basically determine that his bloodline power was likely the extreme condition type mentioned by the other party. In the most extreme case, this ability would most likely require a state of unconsciousness, near death, or even death to activate. Regarding this, he found roughly 2 pieces of evidence from the memories of the former Anson. First, according to Louis Bernard, Anson should have received sufficient training and had initially awakened his bloodline power, otherwise, it would have been impossible to detect the bloodline power within him, let alone know that he was a gifted individual. Second, in the memories of the former Anson that Anson inherited, besides the lack of memories related to bloodline power, all memories of the former Anson's death were also lost. This was no coincidence. Therefore, Anson made a hypothesis: the condition for activating his bloodline power was near death or unconsciousness, the ability was resurrection, and the cost was losing the memories of the short period before activating his bloodline power. This would explain why he woke up completely unharmed, with bloodstains on the table and his body, and a lead bullet stuck in his throat. If this was true, then in dire situations, as long as he could avoid fatal injuries that would immediately kill him, he could at least buy himself a chance to turn the tide. Considering the possibility of amnesia, he needed to leave behind crucial traces and evidence before being killed, to tell his resurrected self what to do. Of course, all of this was just his deduction. Even for the sake of testing his abilities, Anson wouldn't be foolish enough to attempt suicide, but as a last resort, it was the perfect measure. Huff. Lying in a pool of blood, Anson suddenly opened his eyes, his mouth agape as he inhaled deeply, like someone about to drown. Anson Bach, was alive. His slightly trembling arm reached towards his chest, where it still ached as if pierced by a sharp blade. There lay a letter, its surface almost soaked with blood, containing a hastily written message: plan successful. Chapter 52, The Plan. Clang. With a crisp metallic clang, Lisa leaped to her feet, narrowly missing Crow, who was wielding a pale bone blade. In the instant sparks flew, the already chipped bayonet tore open Crow's shoulder again, and foul-smelling pus and blood gushed from the writhing, rotting flesh. The next second, the petite figure, who had rolled to the ground, raised her gun again and pulled the trigger at Crow's back. Bang! The lead bullet exploded in Crow's back, tearing through flesh and blood, and the burly figure collapsed uncontrollably to the ground as if struck by a heavy hammer. Not enough. This wasn't enough. She hadn't torn it to shreds yet. She hadn't made him pay the price yet. The girl, her tears dried, let out a low growl through her gaping teeth, her legs suddenly springing off the ground as she lunged at the fallen Crow. Clang! Just as the bayonet struck, the pale bone blade, controlled by her writhing right arm, slammed into the rifle in Lisa's hand with the force of a broken arm. The steel-forged barrel warped with a terrible groan, snapping in two along with the wooden shaft. In the instant of loss of balance, a whistling blade grazed Lisa's head, causing her petite body, momentarily caught off guard, to lurch forward. Then, she struck Crow's oncoming knee. Thump! The powerful knee strike sent Lisa flying like a cannonball, crashing heavily into a pillar amidst the flames. Bricks shattered, and dust billowed. The battered Lisa rose from the pool of blood at her feet, her trembling legs supporting her bruised and wounded, frail body, which was nearing its limit after countless impacts. Only her reddened eyes remained unchanged. She retrieved the last loaded rifle from her back, her small, wounded hands holding the gun without trembling. Krog stood up again, the wound on his back now replaced by large, writhing, deformed pieces of flesh, with a whistling sound as the air was torn apart. His massive figure was already close to Lisa. Almost instinctively, Lisa moved with lightning speed, easily dodging the pale bone blade that came crashing down on her. The moment the sound of shattering bricks rang out, the terrifying and eerie blade changed angle, sweeping towards her. In that instant, Lisa, her eyes bloodshot, did not choose to retreat, but instead leaped up, charging straight into Krog's chest. Raising her rifle high, she cleaved it like a two-handed greatsword at his tumor-like head. PFFT, bursting pus and blood sprayed all over her, making her tear-streaked, lovely face contoured into a grotesque grimace. She slowly plunged the bayonet, muzzle and all, into Krog's body through his shattered neck. Tear it apart, tear it apart, tear it apart. Die! Roaring, Lisa pulled the trigger. Bang! In the instant the gunfire erupted, Lisa was sent flying. Krog, who had grabbed the barrel at the last moment, threw both the rifle and Lisa into the raging flames. The bullet from the muzzle pierced through the flesh, connecting the pale bone blade. The petite figure, falling into the sea of fire, rolled away to escape, leaving only some dust and burn marks on her body, but she lost her last rifle. Barehanded, she rose again from the pool of blood, growling at Krog's figure across the burning flames like a wounded cub. Clang! Krog picked up the torn greatsword again, as if some memory had awakened in its consciousness. The flesh gripping the hilt writhed violently, turning the mechanism on it. With the sound of gears and mechanisms turning, the blood-soaked blade broke off section by section, and serrated teeth full of nicks and engraved with strange runes popped out from the center of the blade on both sides. The nearly 2-meter-long two-handed greatsword transformed into a monstrous, terrifying whip. The next second, Krog swung the hilt with one hand, the whistling blade cutting through the flames towards Lisa. Her nimble figure dodged the oncoming fatal blow, the constantly swirling blade like a living monster, relentlessly pursuing the evasive figure. Even though her heart was completely consumed by rage, Lisa knew that without her weapon, she had no chance of directly confronting that terrifying blade. Dodging was the only option. Leaping, rolling, sliding, evading. In the not-so-spacious main hall, the cub-like girl, with her petite frame and swift movements, evaded Krog's attacks wave after wave. The greatsword, crackling and exploding between the bricks, repeatedly grazed past her. But Krog showed no signs of stopping. New flesh writhed on his arm. Wielding the greatsword, the terrifying weapon forged from steel seemed to have become an integral part of his body, launching relentless new attacks. This one-sided dodging couldn't last long. The moment Lisa landed again, finding herself in a corner, she immediately realized she had no way out. The shrill greatsword swung up again, aimed at her petite frame. In that instant, Lisa, her eyes wide, suddenly stopped dodging, her stunned face showing disbelief. Boom! A gunshot rang out, the sparks exploding in mid-air, deflecting the descending sword. Slightly panting, Anson tossed his still smoking rifle into the pool of blood, standing bare-handed behind Krog. Anson, the redness in Lisa's pupils faded instantly as she screamed, replaced by a mixture of surprise and astonishment on her dirty little face. Anson, you're alive! She had just witnessed Krog's pale bone blade pierce Anson's chest, and him, coughing up blood, struggling to his death as he collapsed at the monster's feet. But now, he stood before her unharmed, with almost no visible fatal wounds except for tattered clothes. His scratches and cuts were even fewer than hers. A fleeting moment of confusion crossed Lisa's mind, quickly replaced by joy. Anson was alive, after all. Alive was good. Being alive meant he could eat. It seems so. Anson nodded with a light laugh, his gaze sweeping over Krog, who had turned and was dragging his greatsword towards him. Staring at the infantry knife and rifle barrel protruding from Krog's chest, he quickly realized something after a moment's thought. Lisa, here, the girl, called by name, immediately stood up, assuming an attack stance against Crow despite being unarmed. Listen carefully, my next order concerns the lives of you, me, Carl Bain, the 1st Regiment, and thousands of men outside. Though his words were serious, Anson, staring at the approaching Crow, spoke as casually as if discussing the weather and dinner. When this monster charges at me, immediately turn back and find Carl. Tell him to bring his entire regiment down in 5 minutes. Also, tell him that no matter what he does, in 5 minutes, he must signal Brigadier General Ludwig at the artillery position to concentrate all artillery fire towards the main castle. Understand? Yes. Understand. Huh? Lisa, who had answered excitedly, suddenly paused, but then, Anson. You, me. Anson, unarmed, smiled faintly. "Don't worry, because it's all part of the plan." Chapter 53 Kroger's Heart. The instant Lisa turned and sprinted towards the stairs, Crow abruptly drew his greatsword and swung it at the petite figure without warning. A piercing shriek tore through the air from behind, and Lisa, almost instinctively, paused, then quickened her pace without hesitation, rushing towards the stairs. Clang! A lead bullet struck the tip of the sword, sending a spark flying. The serpentine chain sword veered slightly, crashing against the wall outside the door, narrowly missing Lisa. Watching the girl's departing figure, Anson, who had breathed a slight sigh of relief, grew increasingly grave, slowly beginning to reload the revolver he had just retrieved from the pool of blood. 5 minutes. This was all the time Anson had left himself to make a desperate gamble. If all the clues his pre-death self had left for his present self couldn't kill Crow within these 5 minutes, he would have to prepare for the old god's exposure. Besides Krog, Anson also had to explain why he knew this information and why he tried to conceal it. The Church of Order would definitely hunt him down as a traitor whose hobby was the old gods, and the Archbishop's own son would be happy to pin the blame for the failed siege of Thunder Castle on him. He would have to live under an assumed name from now on, evading the Church and numerous official forces, and seeking a bright future in the evil underground organization of the Black Mages. Unless he failed to kill this monster bearing the name Krog within 5 minutes. Whoosh! Sensing Krog's approach, Anson, his body stiffening, activated all his potential and dodged sharply to the left. Almost simultaneously, the jet-black tearing greatsword rushed towards the direction he had dodged with astonishing speed, and his right hand, close to the afterimage of the blade, rose up, pointing the gun at Krog's head. Gunfire erupted, and a blood-red single eye exploded in the center of the writhing, lumpy head. Boom! From within the billowing smoke, the figure of Krog dragging his greatsword vaguely appeared. In the center of the still gushing pus-filled wound, Anson's slightly bewildered face was reflected in a brand new blood-red eye. The him who had previously fallen into a temporary coma upon losing his head now showed no reaction whatsoever. Headshots were ineffective, and lead bullets shouldn't be expected to cause any damage. Was it to remind himself of this that himself before death had deliberately discarded all his weapons? A chill ran through Anson, who barely had time to think before lunging forward to his left. Thump! Almost the instant he moved, the afterimage of the chainsword had already swept past where he had just stood, a cloud of dust erupting from the wall of the main hall behind him. As the smoke cleared, the tip of the greatsword, tearing through the wall, was completely embedded in it, pinning the entire chainsword to the surface. Seizing this opportunity, Anson, stepping over the pool of blood, charged straight at Krog's figure. Crow, having missed his attack, seemed to have anticipated this. His left arm, as if boneless, twitched and writhed violently, his fist clenching with astonishing speed and thrusting towards Anson's face. Whoosh! The wind from the punch whipped Anson's hair, and he could almost feel the excruciating pain in his eardrums. Instinctively, he turned and raised his arm, striking Crow's fist with his left elbow. Crack! The terrifying impact surged forth, and Anson's expression contorted in pain as he felt the horrific force, giving him the illusion that he was facing a battering ram with his bare flesh. But Anson stopped. In that instant of impact, he clearly felt an unusual force surge into his arm, allowing him to block Crow's iron fist instead of instantly shattering his bones and sending him flying. This was the power of bloodline? His expression one of astonishment. He had no time to think further before seeing Crow's violently writhing arm, moving with superhuman speed, hurtle towards him like a raging torrent. Hook punches, knee strikes, thrusts, counterattacks. With his right hand restrained by the greatsword tearing through the wall, Krog's attacks, pinned to the spot, were as fierce as a storm. The deafening roar of tearing air echoed continuously in Anson's ears as he unleashed a barrage of attacks, each one more illogical and cunningly angled, seemingly designed to overwhelm him. Using the sudden surge of power within him, Anson, almost completely overwhelmed by Krog's onslaught, abandoned his offensive, focusing solely on parrying and dodging. His impeccable distance judgment as a sorcerer allowed him to repeatedly graze the edges, using minimal side turns and movements to evade fatal blows. At this moment, Krog seemed like a completely different person, impatient and ferocious, giving Anson no chance to approach or catch his breath. His crazed demeanor was like that of a wild beast sensing danger. Bang! Bang! Anson, his face contorted in pain as he blocked Krog's cannonball-like punches with his elbow, drew his revolver and fired 2 shots at the lower part of Krog's torso. With his thigh and knee simultaneously broken, Krog instantly lost his balance, his body, encased in fleshy growths, tilting backward from the impact of the lead bullet. Anson flicked his right hand, throwing the empty revolver magazine to the left, his left hand, gripping the lead bullet, clenched tightly, imprinting, gathering flame, onto it. Just then, Anson, preparing to draw his gun and pursue, suddenly felt a chill run down his spine, then without hesitation rolled to the side to dodge. Whoosh! Just as Krog fell, the greatsword was pulled from the shattered wall. The black blade emitted a terrifying shriek as if alive, lunging at Anson like a venomous snake. Almost simultaneously, Krog, now rising, had already pounced on the spot where Anson had fallen. From the center of the writhing fleshy growths, blood-red eyes greedily stared at Anson's figure, like a ravenous beast eyeing its prey. The next second, facing the dark afterimage reflected in his pupils, Anson, his expression calm, raised his gun and fired. A lead bullet, coated with a concentrated flame, shot out from the muzzle flash, igniting in flames just before colliding with his sword tip. Boom! A golden red explosion erupted in the air, the shockwave blasting away the greatsword and sending Anson flying. But not behind him, but directly in front of the charging Krog's chest. The shockwave whistled past his ears, and using the force of the impact, Anson curled up, lunging at Krog like a cannonball. Thud! The writhing, iron fist exploded precisely in Anson's chest. Anson, eyes wide, clung to Krog's left arm, blood gushing from his mouth. But just as Krog prepared to pull back his fist to deliver a fatal blow, he found his arm restrained. Trembling, Anson gripped Krog's arm tightly with his left forearm. His trembling right hand seized the hilt of the sword embedded in his chest. Crow Bernard, feeling the violent spasms in his chest, Anson, his smile more painful than a grimace, slowly raised his head, staring intently into those blood-red eyes. You tell me, a monster like you, whose flesh can multiply infinitely, who can't be killed even by a headshot, if your heart is crushed, can it really grow back? I guess we're both pretty curious, so, let's try it. The moment the words left his lips, Anson had already imprinted, gathering flame, onto the military knife piercing Crow's chest. The hilt he gripped instantly became scorching hot, and an unusual red glow began to emanate from beneath the writhing flesh. The next second, golden red flames burst from the flesh, piercing Crow's chest like a flaming spear. Boom! The deafening roar echoed as Anson, ignoring the pain, slammed to the ground, landing face first. Exploding flames first pierced vertically, then engulfed Krog's body. The writhing flesh was like a gigantic torch, a blinding spectacle in the blood-soaked main hall. When the roar subsided, Anson cautiously raised his head. Only a charred silhouette remained amidst the raging flames. Encased in the center of that charred shell was a heart. A heart that was still beating. Chapter 54 Triumph. Thump. 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 Anson's gaze froze as he stared at the beating heart. On its blood-soaked, charred surface was a six-pointed star, identical to his own. Unlike his own marks, which seemed branded and burned, this one looked like a cut from a sharp weapon. A six-pointed star carved into the heart with a sharp blade. Was that the mark of a blood mage? While Anson was still stunned, the still-beating heart suddenly began to gush forth foul-smelling pus and blood from the rupture. The festering wound writhed wildly, sprouting lumps filled with pus. The dense clusters of pustules completely enveloped the heart, expanding outwards with the overflowing pus and flesh, quickly forming a boneless, torso-shaped lumps. Was it trying to revive? Thump. 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 Anson, his expression one of shock, immediately rose, his body writhing in agony as he lunged at Kroger's charred corpse in the inferno, his revolver aimed at the heart and fired rapidly. Bang! 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 The lead bullets, hitting their mark repeatedly, exploded near the tumor in the heart, sending pus-filled flesh and blood bursting outwards like a gushing geyser. In the center of the mangled, bloodied torso, the beating heart was once again exposed. Now, gritting his teeth, Anson plunged into the flames, his outstretched right hand plunging into the center of the still expanding tumor, forcefully pulling the heart out. Along with chunks of flesh and blood, covered in pus, Anson's right hand tightly gripped the still beating heart in his palm. Almost the instant he clutched his heart, a sharp pain shot through his palm. Pus oozing from his heart was eroding his right hand, and at a visible speed, a swollen tumor was attaching itself to his arm. Anson's pupils constricted sharply. Without hesitation, he gripped the still smoking, hot military knife and plunged it into his heart, tearing off the flesh from his right palm and forearm. His heart, pierced by the knife, continued to beat, gushing pus and blood, hungrily devouring Anson's flesh, clinging to the tumor, slowly rotting, dissolving, and finally completely dissolving into the ever-growing pustules and tumor. So, this is the secret of the so-called unlimited proliferation of flesh and blood? It wasn't about infinite proliferation, but rather like a perpetually ravenous sac, constantly devouring flesh and blood that approached it. Even mere touch would result in rapid corrosion and assimilation. And its host, in this process of continuous devouring and becoming stronger, would gradually lose itself, flesh and blood, internal organs, brain. When Crow Bernard, who had been shot in the head by Lisa the first time, rose again, how much of himself remained? Gazing at the still beating heart pierced by the blade, Anson, with a complex expression, slowly raised his right hand and snapped his fingers lightly. The heart, imprinted with gathering flame, ignited, and under Anson's silent gaze, clinging to the flames, it slowly lost its vitality, withered, and turned into flying dust and black smoke, dissipating into the air. It was over. Watching Crow Bernard vanish into thin air, Anson, who had survived by exerting all his strength and even risking his life, felt no joy of victory in his empty heart. Only blood can grant immortality. This was the ultimate fate of Crow Bernard, who had become a blood mage, and himself? Only destruction can bring greatness. Having chosen the path of a pyromancer, what fate awaited him? The dimly lit main hall was utterly silent. A minute later, hurried footsteps echoed from the staircases on either side of the main hall. Before even descending the stairs, Carl smelled the pungent stench of blood and gunpowder. When the soldiers stormed into the main hall, everyone froze. The colors of blood and flame filled every dilated eye. The walls were smeared with foul-smelling pus and blood, severed limbs and corpses lay strewn about, submerged in pools of blood that overflowed the floor. Burning flames sizzled and flowed like liquid in the blood. Seeing this scene resembling a burning hell, the pale-faced recruits collapsed to the ground one after another, vomiting uncontrollably. Feeling nauseous, Carl Bain frowned, scanning the entire hall. Apart from his commander, he couldn't see the man who should be here. Crow Bernard. Among the countless corpses, the Imperial garrison commander was nowhere to be seen. Corpses, heads, even his uniform, the only proof of his identity, was gone. Only the greatsword, impossible for a normal person to wield, lay silently in the pool of blood beside Anson. What had happened? Even if he was riddled with shreds by a grenade, surely there should be some remains. Recalling Lisa's animated gestures when she came to him, Carl decided it was best not to ask. Taking a deep breath, Carl forced back his questions, pretending he hadn't seen anything and nothing had happened, and walked towards Anson, who stood there stunned. "What are you thinking about, Commander?" Nothing." Anson, coming back to his senses, glanced sideways at Carl, who was forcing a smile. "Where's Lisa?" "As you ordered, I sent her to relay the message to the artillery position. Only someone as inconspicuous as her could slip through the cracks of battle." Carl shrugged, his sharp eyes immediately noticing Anson's bloodied right hand and clearly burned left hand. Yet, strangely enough, even on the chest of his blood-soaked, torn uniform, there was only a tiny, inconspicuous bruise. "So, you won." "I won," Anson nodded. "What about Crow Bernard?" Carl asked deliberately. Anson's expression was somewhat melancholy. "He is no longer important." "All right." Suppressing the urge to press further, Carl nodded. "So what's next?" "The fighting outside is still raging, and the thousands of conscripted soldiers might be driven out again by the Imperial scum. What do we do?" "Simple." Anson picked up the torn greatsword from the ground and casually tossed it to Carl. "We'll return in triumph." "Triumph?" Carl, catching it in a panic, gripped the hilt tightly with both hands, nearly getting crushed to death on the spot. "Yes, triumph." Anson nodded vigorously, a smile playing on his lips, and strode towards the soldiers who were lying on the ground vomiting uncontrollably. "Soldiers, listen up. The 1st Platoon, we have captured the main fortress of Thunder Fortress, killed the commander of the Imperial garrison, and won the most crucial victory of this battle. Tell me, what do we do after the victory?" "Triumph," the soldiers, still vomiting, called out weakly in 2s and 3s. "Louder." "I didn't hear you," Anson roared, brandishing his saber. "Triumphant. Triumphant. 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 Triumphant." Loud shouts echoed in waves, reverberating deafeningly throughout the main hall. "Well said." He clenched his fist at his chest, brandishing his sword towards the main gate of the fortress. "We've won. We'll return in triumph. So we'll march out of the main gate with our heads held high. delivering a fatal blow to those Imperial scum who are still putting up a last stand. First column, 2 columns follow me. Target, Thunder Fortress, towards victory, forward. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 55: The Gunshots That Ended the Rainstorm. At 3:12 a.m., the siege of Thunder Fortress began. Compared to the relentless torrential rain, the fiercely contested battle, which had reached a fever pitch, was gradually showing signs of abating. At the outset, the unprepared and unforeseen Imperial defenders suffered heavy losses, the city gates fell, the artillery emplacements were destroyed, and coupled with the initial misjudgments of the forward commanders, nearly 1/5 of their forces were wasted in the pointless defense of the city gates, overwhelmed in 2 waves by the conscripted troops employed in sheer numbers. The vast disparity in troop numbers, coupled with the fragmented defensive forces, quickly severed the communication between the Imperial defenders stationed at various points as thousands of conscripts stormed into the fortress. Several smaller units were even isolated and surrounded, and subsequently annihilated after the death of their commanding knight officers. But as the battle intensified, the balance of power began to tip in favor of the conscripted forces. Despite being cut off from communication, the Imperial defenders maintained a complete command and organizational system, and the morale of the Imperial soldiers was generally high until their officers were killed. In contrast, the conscripted forces' organization collapsed the moment they stormed the city gates. Mid-ranking officers could only control a company at most, some even losing sight of their platoon leaders and their orders. As for the highest-ranking commanders on both sides, they had completely lost control of their armies from the outset, for various reasons, making it impossible for them to execute any sophisticated tactics. They could only await the outcome. With both sides lacking their highest commanders, and their soldiers equally rigid and inflexible, their discipline and morale maintained only by whips and pay, the Imperial defenders began to demonstrate their greatest advantage, a rank of knights with mediocre tactical skills but exceptional combat prowess, willing to die for honor and disregarding the lives of their men. These knights, of humble origins and unable to afford war horses, serving only as infantry officers, those who could afford them all became cavalry, possessed a thirst for battle far exceeding that of their rank and even lower-ranking cavalry officers. In a normal line battle, their outdated knightly swordsmanship was meaningless, from volley fire to slow-motion shots to bayonet charges, but in the melee against a conscripted army utterly untrained in standard bayonet charges, these knights were virtually invincible. Relying on their superhuman individual combat prowess, they withstood the conscripted army's first, tactically devoid charge, and despite receiving no effective orders, these low-ranking officers, following tradition from the previous era, recklessly converged on the nearest banner after routing the enemy in the front. The disorganized and commandless conscripted army was utterly unable to stop them, even if they wanted to. 1 or 2 companies in the melee could not withstand the desperate charge of the elite knights. By the time those mid-ranking officers who had initially planned to reap the benefits realized this, it was too late. No matter how rigid and inflexible the Imperial garrison's battle line was, it couldn't be easily broken by a bunch of scattered soldiers. However, similarly, the Imperial garrison, having lost its emplacements and heavy artillery, was utterly incapable of completely driving the conscripted troops out of the fortress. They could only repel wave after wave of meaningless attacks to maintain the line from collapsing. Both sides, helpless against each other in the torrential rain, were locked in a pointless stalemate. We can't drag this out any longer. Inside Thunder Fortress, another chaotic attack was routed by the Imperial garrison's volleys of gunfire. Lieutenant Colonel Roman, watching helplessly as his fleeing soldiers scattered, gritted his teeth in exasperation and roared behind him, "Messenger, here!" An officer with bloodshot eyes swayed, then straightened his back and answered loudly. "Sound a bugle. Get the Grenadier Regiment in position." "Yes, sir." The messenger hesitated for a moment, then instinctively obeyed. The stirring bugle call tore through the rain, and a square formation, pushing through the retreating tide, marched in orderly fashion into the chaotic front lines of the collapsed battlefield. They were extremely small, only 2 companies after their forced march back to the battlefield. The soldiers looked exhausted, their thin uniforms, already soaked through, offered no protection from the wind and rain, their boots filled with mud, and many had even lost their boots. But no matter how disheveled they looked, the intense, chilling aura and their undeniably arrogant military bearing still made many of the fleeing soldiers stop in their tracks, or at least avoid them. Because they were the Grenadier Regiment. Completely different from the conscripted soldiers who had received less than 3 months of training, they were a regular elite force brought by Ludwig from the central provinces. Looking at his men, who were forcing themselves to stay focused, Lieutenant Colonel Roman knew very well that sending them on a forced march through the torrential rain and then immediately into battle was far too much of a strain, and their fighting strength would certainly be greatly diminished. But it was already 3 in the morning, and dawn could break at any moment. If they could maintain their lines once they saw the enemy, given the low morale of the conscripted troops, he wouldn't be surprised if they collapsed on the spot. He had no choice. With a resolute expression, Roman turned his back to his comrades, pointing his saber at the enemy. Grenadiers, advance! The grenadiers, rifles raised high, shifted from their formation to a looser line, advancing towards the Imperial defenders' lines amidst the torrential rain and the rout. The Imperial defenders, having just repelled an attack, quickly noticed their presence. The knights, wielding sabers and longswords, shouted, urging their soldiers to immediately counterattack. Bang! Bang! A rapid, chaotic volley of gunfire erupted, casting a thick cloud of smoke before the Imperial defenders' ranks. In the blink of an eye, a tenth of the thinly packed Grenadier Regiment had fallen. Yet, their faces showed no panic or hesitation. Not a single soldier glanced at their comrades beside them, their heads pierced by lead bullets, or howling in agony from their wounds. They continued advancing amidst the gunfire, their unhurried demeanor as if strolling leisurely through a rain-soaked battlefield, until they reached the front lines. Grenadier Regiment, take your positions. At Roman's command, the grenadiers halted, their thin, narrow ranks rising in perfect unison like dominoes. Almost simultaneously, the opposing Imperial defenders had also completed their formation, their not-so-wide battle line now bearing more than 3 times the number of rifles aimed at the grenadiers. A deathly silence fell over the battlefield, both sides awaited the moment the other would open fire. Lieutenant Colonel Roman, his face grim, raised his trembling saber high above his head. Boom! The deathly silence was shattered by a deafening roar. Huh? Roman, staring intently at the enemy lines, suddenly wore an expression of disbelief. It wasn't the sound of artillery fire, but the sound of the main gate of Thunder Fortress being smashed open. And emerging from the gate wasn't Crow Bernard, the commander of the Imperial garrison, but Anson Bach of the 1st Regiment. Stunned, Roman almost forgot to lower his saber. He wasn't the only one surprised when they saw the battle flag with its blood-stained horn of Clovis appear beneath the main gate. Countless people gaped in shock, friend or foe alike. Bang! A thunderous volley exploded, instantly felling countless Imperial defenders caught completely off guard. Amidst the thick smoke of battle, Anson emerged from the ranks, followed closely by Karl Bane, greatsword in hand, who stared fearfully at the dozens, even hundreds, of guns pointed at them, as if the next second he and this fearless madman would be riddled with bullets. But he was mistaken. The moment they saw the greatsword in his hand, all the officers and soldiers froze, their faces contorted in shock. That sword! It was Lord Kroger Bernard's tearing greatsword. These scum of the kingdom of Clovis, had killed Lord Kroger Bernard. Gazing at the deathly silent battlefield of Thunder Fortress, Anson confidently raised the corners of his mouth. In the name of the victors, I, Anson Bach, hereby declare, Kroger Bernard is dead. This city belongs to the kingdom of Clovis. Chapter 56 New Year's Gift. The torrential rain subsided, and the sun rose. As the first rays of sunlight of the 100th year of the saint's calendar shone upon the towers of Thunder Keep, the Clovis unicorn banner fluttering in the cold wind on the shattered walls, and the imperial iris banner cast into the muddy puddles littered with corpses, together proclaimed the end of the siege of Thunder Keep. In reality, the battle was already over when Anson Bach burst out of the main castle, brandishing his ripped greatsword and declaring, Kroger Bernard is dead. The imperial army's weaknesses were laid bare at that moment. One moment their morale was high, and they were fighting the conscripted troops with great flair. The moment they discovered their commander had fallen, morale plummeted. Apart from a very few fearless knights who put up a desperate resistance, only to be subsequently riddled with bullets, the vast majority of officers and soldiers chose to lay down their weapons and banners. 10 minutes later, Ludwig Franz, who had rushed to the battlefield, accepted their surrender and, as commander of the conscription army, promised them that he would ensure the safety of every officer's life and property until the ransom was received. This promise from the Archbishop's favorite son relieved all the knights, who were also glad they hadn't chosen to die like their colleagues. As for the remaining hundreds of surviving imperial soldiers, their fate was not so easy. The Empire will definitely ransom them. Hundreds of soldiers and their weapons are a considerable fortune, but the diplomats on both sides will certainly make a big fuss about the ransom price, so the process won't be easy. Walking on the muddy grounds of Thunderberg, Ludwig, though exhausted, spoke with unusual lightness. Until then, these people will be under the supervision of our conscription army. So, Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, I now need a proper post-war settlement plan. Even without looking, one could sense Ludwig struggling to suppress his urge to beam with excitement. How about letting them take charge of the siege positions outside the city? Anson asked absent-mindedly, feeling extremely sleepy. The battle was over, and the entire conscripted army was busy taking over the affairs of Thunder Fortress, or rather, busy dividing up the hard-won spoils of victory. Weapons, ammunition, supplies, even cash. A heavily guarded fortress would certainly have a treasury storing large sums of military pay. The moment Thunder Fortress fell and was recaptured, the mountains of supplies stockpiled within the fortress all became the conscripted army's spoils of war. Although most of the captured supplies had to be sealed and awaited inspection by the army commanders in the rear, the biggest advantage of the conscripted army, a ragtag force, compared to the regular army was the extremely high standard of spoils. So Anson didn't understand why Ludwig, as the supreme commander and also the largest shareholder of the conscripted army, wasn't hurrying to claim his spoils of victory, but instead insisted on bringing him out to discuss the issue of prisoners. What was he planning? The siege positions, the battle is over, and the siege positions outside the city definitely need to be filled in. That was a project that took thousands of people over 10 days to complete, so filing them in completely isn't easy. Anson, following closely behind, truthfully stated, so why not let the prisoners do it? Ludwig murmured, both tempted and worried, but wouldn't that be too inefficient? The army won't let us stay here for too long. At most, new orders will come in a month, and what if it's not finished by then? Then we'll use a performance-based system. The sleepy-eyed Anson continued to offer a perfunctory reply. Performance? Yes, the same methods used for farm supervisors and factory workers. After a moment's thought, and confirming that the term existed in the former Anson's memories, Anson replied without hesitation, promise the prisoners they'll be released after the war, but until then they have to work hard to get supplies, set some targets, like how much work they can do in a day to get more supplies, or allow them a day off. Of course, surveillance and supervision are a must. Those who are particularly lazy or unable to do heavy work can be used as examples, making them do heavy work while being beaten in the most conspicuous place. Don't beat them too badly, just enough for everyone to hear and see, if it's too late in the end. Find a few honest examples to help them get released, and tell the prisoners that after we withdraw, they will be handed over to other troops, which should probably motivate them a bit. In short, as long as the reward and punishment standards are set, and every prisoner can see it with their own eyes, even the most unwilling prisoner can. Exhausted and having let his guard down, Anson launched into a long, rambling monologue until Ludwig stopped, noticing the brigadier general had turned and was looking at him strangely. What's wrong? Nothing. Ludwig shook his head, scrutinizing him as if you were seeing him for the first time. I just suddenly realized that if you hadn't joined the army, you'd probably be a rather pragmatic entrepreneur or foreman, Anson. But I didn't call you here specifically to have a long talk about life ideals. The brigadier general, his gaze sharpening, quickly regained its usual coldness, his steady eyes turning to Anson. We've arrived? Startled awake, Anson raised an eyebrow slightly, following the other's gaze. This is the Thunder Fortress's reserve warehouse, the largest of the 6 warehouses outside this fortress. More importantly, it's the only one of the 6 that hasn't been touched by the Imperial garrison, Ludwig replied without turning his head, his sharp eyes intentionally or unintentionally glancing at Anson's expression out of the corner of his eye. If the accounts are correct, this place stores enough weapons and ammunition to equip 10 infantry regiments, including, but not limited to, 20,000 rifles, 10,000 boxes of lead bullets and propellant, 40,000 sets of uniforms and pack bags. Emergency reserves, a rough estimate puts its value at around 150,000 in gold coins, of course. A slight smile curved his lips as Ludwig took a key from his pocket and handed it to Anson. Now, it's yours. Anson's pupils constricted, staring at the brigadier general in disbelief. "Wait? You mean, of course, according to the kingdom's laws, you can only take 50%, the rest will be sealed." Ludwig's smile deepened as he shoved the key into the dumbfounded Anson's hand. "Consider it my New Year's gift to you, Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, although it's a slight regret that we failed to capture the Bernard brothers alive. As the victors of the siege of Thunderberg, this spoils are yours. I, Ludwig Franz, know better than anyone, without your help, without your plan, the 19-day siege of Thunderberg would have been nothing but empty talk. Most importantly, without your forceful insistence on my decision, at the moment the storm began. I think I wouldn't have had the courage to oppose my father, the Archbishop of the kingdom." At this moment, a hint of self-mockery appeared on Ludwig's cold face, and he let out a soft sigh of relief. "So don't hesitate, there's no favor involved here, and even if there is, please accept my sincerest gratitude. Like I said, consider it a New Year's gift." Looking at Ludwig's sincere gaze, Anson, recovering from his shock, nodded, accepting this unique gift. With a faint smile, the brigadier general, his expression returning to normal, turned back and raised his right hand to the guards on either side of the warehouse door. A low scraping sound rang out, and the tightly closed warehouse door opened before them like a legendary elven treasure vault. At that moment, the two standing outside held their breath in unison. The equipment of 10 infantry regiments piled up in one warehouse. What a magnificent sight that would be! Thump! The heavy door opened, and golden sunlight streamed into the towering, magnificent warehouse. Tall, magnificent, vast, and then, empty. Nothing at all. Not just seemingly empty, but truly empty, not even a speck of dust. In the vast, empty warehouse, only their two tiny figures remained. The spotless floor reflected the morning sunlight, almost blindingly so. Squinting slightly, a bewildered Anson turned around. Beside him, Ludwig stared unblinkingly, his expression frozen, as if he couldn't accept reality, as if in a dream. Anson opened his mouth, hesitated for a full minute, then said in a remarkably relaxed and cheerful tone, "Happy New Year." Chapter 57. Cheers. "My lord, what are your thoughts?" In a room within Thunder Fortress, after hearing the whole story, Carl Bain, a local strongman of Thunder Fortress, was not only not shocked, but even wanted to laugh. If that warehouse wasn't emptied, how could those Imperial scum have left it untouched? But this is Thunder Fortress, the largest supply depot and barracks north of the southern fortress. Anson, looking bewildered, still couldn't understand. If the equipment of those 10 infantry regiments is missing, where could it have gone? That's simple. A playful smile, typical of a veteran, appeared on Carl's face as he magically produced a bottle of rum from behind his back and placed it steadily on the table. "Whoever pays for it." "It's there." Anson paused, looking at the bottle Carl had produced. "Reselling arms, or, this batch of arms never existed in the first place." Carl shrugged. "The Privy Council placed the order, the money went to some bigwig in charge of military supplies, and all he had to do was send 100 empty wagons to Thunder Castle and back, and then, poof," he made an explosion gesture at Anson, "that spacious warehouse will be overflowing with military supplies that no one can see. Won't they be discovered?" Being so blatant, Anson was still skeptical. The clerk who issued the permits, the inspector in charge of the transport, the accountant who checked the books, and the fortress commander, which of these people do you think is absolutely loyal to the kingdom and won't accept bribes? Carl countered in a different way. Anson. I don't know about the southern fortress, but those military strongholds near the border and the front lines, they can probably still maintain integrity, right? Ignoring Anson's stunned expression, Carl continued, "When I was a militia company commander, the militia division the garrison commander organized spent 3/10 of the annual tax revenue, and in the end, less than 200 beggars and vagrants were sent to the camp. I even had to find a way to get the guns, compared to those scum who even embezzle organizational positions. Thunder Fortress, which only embezzled supplies, is already considered to have a conscience. Only embezzled supplies?" Anson, slightly taken aback, looked at him in disbelief. "You mean it's not just this one warehouse, but the others too?" Carl Bain coughed twice and nodded vigorously. "Although I don't know the exact figures, judging from the information I've gathered from several other infantry regiments, the entire conscription force has suffered huge losses from top to bottom." Shaking his head, Carl sighed softly. "Apart from the light and heavy artillery that are difficult to move, everything else, firearms, ammunition, daily logistics, and even the most important military rations, is severely out of balance with the accounts." Even disregarding the losses in the chaos of battle and the consumption by the Imperial scum over the past 20 days or so, the entire fortress's reserves are at most only 1/10 of what's on the books. The reserves that were supposed to supply 15 to 20 infantry regiments are now just a pile of dried meat from who knows how many years ago, barely enough to feed a full-strength regiment for a day or two. Carl, somewhat wistfully, unscrewed the cork, sighed, and poured himself and Anson each a glass of rum. Wait a minute. Holding his glass, Anson suddenly felt that something was amiss. You're saying Thunderkeep's reserves can only feed a few hundred more men for another day or two, more or less, maybe even worse? Carl nodded, a hint of schadenfreude in his voice. Anyway, our brigadier general and those commanders have all suffered huge losses, so you're saying the Imperials can only hold out in the fortress for another day or two, and then they'll definitely break out? Anson pressed, his brow twitching uncontrollably. Of course, unless they plan to starve to death here. Carl suddenly realized what he meant, his eyes meeting Anson's in astonishment. If that's the case, then the conscription army doesn't even need to attack, just continuing to besiege Thunderkeep for another 2 or 3 days would be enough to win. Anson, his brow twitching, shook his head inwardly. No. It's not that simple. Besides the nearly 1,000 garrison, Thunderkeep also houses the old gods and Crow Bernard. At this moment, Anson vaguely guessed Crow's plan. From the very first day he arrived at Thundercastle, he discovered the fortress's severely depleted reserves, yet still maintained a posture of holding the city to the death. His aim was to bolster the confidence of the Kingdom of Clovis, prompting them to launch a massive siege. But the truth was, he had planned to retreat from the very beginning, or perhaps he hadn't even considered the lives of his men, waiting for the reserves to run out and the morale of the defenders to crumble, thus luring the conscripted army to attack. What awaited Brigadier General Ludwig was a crumbling army, an easily captured fortress, plus a mutated monster with infinitely proliferating flesh. The conscripted army, having won the victory, wouldn't even have the chance to explain, while Crow Bernard would be remembered as an innocent victim, an imperial knight who fought to the last moment. His suspicion as a follower of the old gods would be completely cleared, never to be mentioned again. Anson murmured to himself, swirling the rum in his glass. Forget it, don't think too much about it, we won, we're alive, that's better than anything. Carl Bain was as pragmatic and dejected as ever. The siege is over, I'll probably stay with the 1st Legion for a while, most likely I'll be left in the fortress as a militia company commander or something, just like before. Where's Lisa? Anson's heart skipped a beat, only then realizing that he hadn't seen the girl since saying goodbye in the main hall. I'm not sure, probably waiting to be discharged like those new recruits at the garrison. Carl shook his head, speaking with a hint of regret and helplessness. She fought brilliantly that night and earned a lot of merit, but, my lord, you don't really think the army would award a medal to a teenage girl, do you? Even if they could, she's just a girl with no status, no identity, who doesn't even know where she came from. Even if she shot Kroger Bernard, she'd still be discharged after the war. There's nothing we can do. She's not a nobleman, she's a girl. Carl, increasingly distressed, took a swig of his drink and glanced at Anson. And you, continuing as commander of the 1st Regiment, how could I? The 1st Regiment is a conscripted infantry regiment. Without the army's approval, Ludwig allowing you to command it until the end of the battle is already the limit. Most importantly, even if he sold everything he owned, he couldn't afford to support an infantry regiment. Oh. So where are you going? The capital, the Royal Military Academy, Anson said casually. My internship is over, I need to go back to collect my graduation certificate. And I also need to meet a certain history professor who calls himself a black mage. So, you're really leaving? Yes. Why do you ask? Carl, his eyes wide with envy, clicked his tongue and pulled a letter from his pocket, slamming it on the table and pushing it in front of Anson. Anson, his gaze instinctively lowered, noticed a receipt tucked inside the letter. What's this? A steam train ticket from Oaktown to the capital, 2nd class. Carl's eyes grew increasingly envious as he spoke. Inside the envelope is a check for 1,000 gold coins, plus a letter of introduction from Brigadier General Ludwig, with a Franz family seal on it. He entrusted me to give this to you, and said that if the army gives you any trouble, you can take it to the Church of Order, a letter of introduction. Anson picked up the envelope and examined it, his expression somewhat taken aback. Although from the moment he accepted the rank of lieutenant colonel, he knew his future was tied to the Franz family and even the Church of Order, but, no matter how powerful they were, The Archbishop of the Church couldn't possibly interfere with the army's arrangements, could he? With a hint of doubt, Anson tucked the envelope into his pocket. The train is at noon the day after tomorrow. The name is Iron Sky. Oh, by the way, Ludwig supposedly arranged for someone to pick you up at the station. Remember to be careful when you board. Who? He didn't tell me. You'll find out when the time comes. Carl shrugged. The two remained silent around the quiet table. This was the moment of farewell. Carl exhaled deeply, looked at Anson, and raised his glass to victory. Anson, raising his glass as well, smiled faintly. To life. Their eyes met, and they drank it all in one gulp. Chapter 58 Ludwig's Letter. In the master bedroom of Remingberg, Ludwig sat alone at his desk, lit the kerosene lamp, put aside all his work, and solemnly placed a letter in front of him. This was a letter that required his serious attention and could not be treated with the slightest carelessness. His right hand, gripping the pen tightly, gently fell, revealing dark, sharply defined characters. To His Excellency Luther Franz, my esteemed father, I am deeply sorry that I only remembered to write to you after receiving your letter. The military operation of the siege of Thunderkessel Fortress has kept me constantly occupied, and the daily tasks have far exceeded my expectations. Many twists and turns have occurred, but after a gamble-like and brutal siege, I captured Thunderkessel at dawn on January 1st, 100th year of the Saints' calendar, and the blood-red unicorn banner once again flies over the lands of the Kingdom of Clovis. Please forgive your son for not following your wishes and making a rash and bold decision, but as you taught me, war is a science that requires deep understanding, meticulous planning, never making arbitrary assumptions, and immense courage at crucial moments. Therefore, although I have always trusted your intuition, this time, as a frontline commander, I made my own judgment. As it turns out, this judgment may not have been entirely correct, but it was not far off either. Ludwig paused here, struggling to resist the urge to delete this section before continuing. I still remember your warning before I left. This is a turbulent era. An era seeking change and breakthroughs. Since the Second Order Council in the 47th year of the saintly calendar canonized Isaac Rand for his research and application of steam engine technology, the balance maintained by the Church of Order has reached its zenith. The reckless expansion of emerging powers, the attempts of the old forces to reclaim their former glory, with the previously distant barriers between kingdoms, lands, and races being broken, turmoil and conflict have reached an inevitable juncture. Yes, I understand. This war between the Empire and the Kingdom of Clovis will not end simply in a few months or even a year, as many have hoped. On the contrary, it is merely a signal, a sign and a beginning, the beginning of a larger, more devastating, and longer war. Maintaining the knightly and feudal system, the backward and corrupt empire possesses vast territory and tens of thousands of knights, while we, the Clovis, whose kingdom has only existed for a few hundred years, rely on the world's first railway network. And despite our small territory and sparse population, we can easily assemble an army far exceeding the empire's size. Under these conditions, the defeat of either side will no longer be merely their own failure, it will be the failure of a power, a system, a framework. The empire strives to maintain its hegemony, while the emerging Clovis kingdom seeks to seize living space, more resources, and a share of trade. To seize resources on land and sea, it must break this hegemony. Neither side will choose a dignified end after one or two heavy battles. As they both imagine, they will fight to the bitter end, regardless of the cost. Like the Battle of Thunder Fortress this time, the depleted Imperial garrison and I, with my supply lines cut off, both pinned their hopes on final victory. This hasty, brief, and shrouded in mystery battle may be a microcosm of the entire war. In a war destined to involve all forces, it would be extremely unwise for the Church of Order to attempt to maintain a balance of power or adhere to outdated principles. For the sake of the Franz family, we cannot stand idly by, nor can we passively become pawns in the conflicts of other factions. Based on this, your son humbly requests that your request for me to return to the capital be refused. After the siege, I will head south to join the legions at the southern fortress and continue to observe the future course of this war. For this purpose, please allow me to recommend a lieutenant colonel named Anson Bach. He is a graduate of the Royal Military Academy, and the entire plan for the siege of Thunderberg was his creation. Despite his youth, his meticulousness and judgment of the battle situation far surpassed those incompetent, noble title-based army staff officers. Through my efforts, he has been promoted from a regular army captain to lieutenant colonel, becoming a member of the Franz family's camp. His specific background and resume are attached to this letter. Furthermore, Although there is no direct evidence, this person should be connected to some old gods organization. If you think Anson Bach can be of use to you, you might as well try to start from this direction. Perhaps you will have some unexpected gains. Of course, this is just a small suggestion. Please consider whether to adopt it. Your humble son, Ludwig Franz. After writing the last stroke, Ludwig breathed a sigh of relief, wrapped the letter carefully, sealed it with ink, and handed it to Lieutenant Colonel Roman, who had been waiting for a long time. It's yours, the sooner the better. Yes, Roman, with a cold expression, said calmly. He took the letter and turned to walk towards the door. Just as he was about to reach the door, he suddenly stopped. Is something wrong? Looking at his close friend's back, Ludwig, who had known him for many years, sensed something was amiss. No, just some trivial curiosity. There are very few things in this world that can pique Roman Walton's curiosity. Ludwig was taken aback for a moment, then chuckled. Speak, what is it? Roman hesitated for a moment, his brows slightly furrowed, before turning to look at Ludwig. General, you are Luther Franz's son, and have lived in the Church of Order since childhood. You must have seen many cases of spellcasters from the old gods, right? Well, you could say that. Then, in your memory, have you ever encountered a spellcaster from the old gods who was also a bloodline power user? How could that be? Ludwig chuckled, speechless. Following the old gods and their evil power means abandoning oneself and betraying one's faith, forever losing the qualification to become a power user. Moreover, which gifted individual possessing bloodline power and inheriting the legacy of the seven knights would abandon their acquired power to follow the so-called old gods despised by the world? Roman nodded slightly and continued to press. Then, have you ever heard of bloodline power that can bring the dead back to life? Resurrection? Ludwig frowned slightly, then hesitated before saying, the bloodlines of the seven knights are the origin of all bloodline power. Although the Church debates the origins of bloodline power, there should be no disagreement on this point. Even Loran, the Grail Knight among the seven knights who is closest to resurrection, merely has a stronger life force than ordinary people. He is far from being able to resurrect. Shouldn't you, as a Wild Hunt Knight gifted individual, know this better than I do? That's right, Roman, his expression calm, said in a deep voice, a barely perceptible tremor in his steady tone. It's just a trivial curiosity. Chapter 59 Departure. On the border between the Kingdom of Clovis and the Empire, in a Church of Order, Louis Bernard sat alone on a bench, his face ashen and his gaze vacant as he stared at the ring of order relief on the wall. After a long journey to this town under imperial control, the garrison commander, having already received word, quickly dispatched 3 of his best physicians and placed him in the local Church of Order for treatment. Even the cavalrymen who had accompanied him were similarly housed in the scenic church, equipped with gas, hot water, clean beds, and private bathrooms, enjoying the sunset from the floor-to-ceiling windows. At this moment, Louis, dressed in his brand-new, ironed uniform, couldn't even smell a trace of gunpowder or blood on himself. The 2 maids sent by the hospitable garrison commander were arguing outside the door about the color scheme of the tablecloth for lunch. The muddy trenches, the collapsed city walls, the battlefield filled with the sounds of fighting and smoke, familiar memories, yet they seemed to come from a very distant world. But it was all an illusion, a mirage. This was the border between the Empire and the Kingdom of Clovis. Even from Thunder Fortress, it would only take a dozen days of forced march to get here. It was only a matter of time before the flames of war spread here. He hadn't fled the battlefield at all, he was merely hiding. After the initial panic, the confusion, the resentment, and even anger he felt towards his brother Krog's arrangements, Louis Bernard, finally calmed down, was left only with self-reproach. Deep self-reproach. Because the current situation, and his brother Krog's decision, were all his own doing. It was his naivety, his arrogance, his being blinded by the dazzling glory, his attempt to end the war single-handedly, without considering the Kingdom of Clovis's reaction, believing that the enemy would truly surrender obediently because he had struck a vital point. His stupidity had made his brother Krog and thousands of excellent soldiers the price of this arrogance. Louis, his face numb, crumpled the battle report he was clutching in his right hand into a ball of waste paper. Crow. He must have guessed the lies behind Anson and Ludwig's exchange, which is why he forced him to leave the battlefield on the eve of the siege. He knew very well that his naive younger brother was not prepared for war. Staying in the fortress would only be a burden that required his attention to worry and protect. You have your own path, and the only thing I can do for you is to let you steadfastly follow that path. and keep going. To protect his naive younger brother, Crow chose to sacrifice himself. Was it worth it? Having accomplished nothing, never realizing he was a burden to others, could he truly bear the glory of the Bernard name? Gazing at the sacred ring of order on the wall, Louis repeatedly questioned himself. The door behind him opened, and steady footsteps echoed in the empty church. A middle-aged man in a dark blue trench coat, holding the latest battle report, sat down beside Louis. "My lord." Noticing the man, Louis was slightly startled and instinctively rose to bow. "No, sit down." The middle-aged man sighed and placed a hand on Louis's shoulder. "I followed your father, Duke Adland, and fought alongside your brother. To me you are like a nephew or son. We don't need these formalities." At the man's insistence, Louis could only nod slightly. Watching the young knight return to his seat, the middle-aged man hesitated for a long time, clutching the battle report in his hand, before letting out a low sigh. "This morning, the latest battle report from the front lines arrived at Thunder Castle." The middle-aged man's voice was somewhat hoarse. "On January 1st, 100th year of the Saints' calendar, around 1 a.m., the Clovis army outside Thunder Castle launched a general offensive. Around 2 a.m., they captured the outer walls and destroyed the fortifications. At 3 a.m., an infantry regiment stormed and occupied the main castle, launching a surprise attack from the main gate, coordinating with the Grenadier Regiment's attack, and routed the last defenders of Thunder Castle. At 3:20 a.m., the surviving hundreds of soldiers and officers surrendered to the Clovis, and Thunder Castle fell." The middle-aged man paused here. His gaze filled with concern as he looked at the calm, marble-sculpted face, Commander Kroger Bernard, his fate unknown. In that instant, the bewildered Louis's body trembled almost imperceptibly, and his pupils, fixed on the ring of order, contracted sharply. This battle report is mostly official news from the Clovis army, so it shouldn't be wrong, except for the great sword Krog always carries. There's nothing else. The middle-aged man pursed his lips, speaking with absolute certainty. The barbaric Clovis are always arrogant. Even if they could find the slightest evidence, they wouldn't utter anything like life or death unknown. Therefore, dear Louis, your brother Krog Bernard must still be alive. We've only lost him temporarily. Perhaps tomorrow, perhaps in a few months, we'll hear news of him. The current hardships and pain are only temporary. The more terrifying the times, the more we must pray, for ourselves, for our loved ones, for them, my lord." A voice devoid of any emotion interrupted the middle-aged man's eloquent speech. Louis turned his head blankly, looking at the somewhat bewildered face that was desperately trying to reassure him. "You came all the way from the military camp, surely not just to tell me this, right?" The handsome young knight's gaze was calm, neither angry nor joyful, as serene as a statue devoid of emotion. The middle-aged man, his brows slightly furrowed, sighed inwardly. "Your arrangements have been made?" The middle-aged man pursed his lips and said in a low voice, "Based on the opinions of the Empire's highest arbitration body, the Court of Judgment, and His Majesty himself, you, Louis Bernard, are hereby granted the title of Royal Attendant and appointed as an envoy to the Kingdom of Iser." Iser, that's right, the elven kingdom that abandoned its corrupt faith and became part of the world of order in the 50 years of the Saints' calendar. Well, I think it was 47 years. The middle-aged man nodded almost imperceptibly. This country, nestled among mountains and dense forests and bordering the kingdom of Clovis to the southeast, has begun to accumulate power in the past few years, attempting to expand southward, but in doing so, the king of Iser, who wants to revive the glory of the elves 1,000 years ago, will have to face a neighbor who also intends to establish hegemony, the Clovis. Louis replied without hesitation. Indeed, war between these two nations is only a matter of time, the middle-aged man continued. But the military of the Iser elves is too backward. Their ignorant traditionalism makes their army utterly vulnerable to the Clovis, so, starting about 2 years ago, the Empire has been sending instructors to the Iser elf kingdom to help them procure rifles and artillery and build a new type of army. And dear Louis, your mission is to help the Iser elf king establish confidence and intervene in this war at the most opportune moment, to coordinate with the Empire's multi-pronged offensive, attacking the Clovis kingdom from both the east and west. Looking at the motionless young knight, the middle-aged man forced a stiff smile. "Of course, I know this doesn't sound very honorable, and as an envoy, you are unlikely to even appear on the battlefield to win your glory, but, no need to say more, sir," Louis interrupted again. "To gain His Majesty Herod's trust is my honor, and even more so the honor of the Bernard family." A hint of reluctance appeared on the middle-aged man's face. Slowly rising to his feet, the young knight, his posture impeccable, turned and walked towards the church exit. Just as he grasped the doorknob, he suddenly turned back to the middle-aged man still seated on the bench, looking at him. "Excuse me, what was the name of the commander of the infantry regiment that stormed Thunderkeep's main fortress?" Chapter 60 Station. January 3rd, year 100 of the Saints' calendar, early morning, Oaktown. Sunny. Anson, slightly straining, dragged his suitcase through the muddy path strewn with footprints, heading towards the station. The clear weather after the downpour made the whole town seem meticulously washed clean. Bright sunlight shone on the scattered rooftops, and a slight, chilly wind blew, erasing the stench of the overflowing, garbage-laden sewage. Small groups of people emerged from the pubs, from the houses, and from the morning mist in the streets and alleys. Street vendors, shouting loudly, are surrounded by groups of middle-aged women who have gone out early. They compare prices of fruits and vegetables soaked in morning dew, fresh fish, and freshly baked bread, their haggling and calls creating a symphony of local music, sometimes high-pitched, sometimes low. A drunkard, lingering outside a hotel, sleepily clutches a bottle with only one sip left. As he stares at the closed hotel door, he pitifully stretches out his hand to beg from passers-by, only to be met with a barrage of disdain. A yawning guard stands lazily on the street, leaning against his rifle and dozing off. In a moment of carelessness, children kick over his rifle, and he falls headfirst into the mud amidst the mocking laughter of those around him. Ragged children darted through the crowd, dodging the enraged guards. They waved rags they'd scavenged from the rubbish heaps, smug as adventurers returning triumphantly from a dragon's cave. Watching the bustling crowds passing by, a scene brimming with liveliness, joy, and all sorts of anxieties and mundane affairs, Anson couldn't help but feel a pang of emotion. If it weren't for the patrolling guards, the few burned-out houses, and the sentry posts outside the town, who would imagine that just days before, this place had been ravaged by war, nearly reduced to ruins? In just a few days, the people living in this town had forgotten the war, returning to their usual tranquility without batting an eye. The large influx of people and goods due to the war had even attracted more merchants and vendors from the surrounding area, making this already bustling town even more prosperous. Dodging the throngs around him, Anson dragged his suitcase towards a fortress-like building in the town center, Oaktown Steam Train Station. Born in the year 95 of the saintly calendar, the Railway Committee of the Kingdom of Clovis resolved to expand the Iron Cross transportation network of the central province outwards, ultimately connecting all major cities, trading centers, and key fortresses within the kingdom by rail. This grand plan, which alarmed the royal family and the Privy Council, and even compelled the Church of Order to intervene, was known as the 95th Year Kingdom Regional Transportation Plan. It also had a more resounding name among the common people, contrasting with the Iron Cross Transportation Network, the Grand Cross Project. From the southernmost hills of the kingdom to the northernmost port, it will only take a month. At a Privy Council meeting before the king, the highest-ranking official of the Railway Committee proudly announced this to the king: "The wealth of the entire kingdom will continuously flow along the tracks to your palace. The entire kingdom will be connected by these rails, truly becoming one." Under this call, the Kingdom of Clovis, having tasted the benefits of the initial railway network, finally resolved to completely pave the entire kingdom with these steel tracks. The Oaktown Steam Train Station was born in this context, becoming the first train station in the kingdom's southward expansion. With the outbreak of war between the Kingdom of Clovis and the Empire, the Grand Cross project was forced to halt. The highly anticipated Oaktown Station, originally a vital transportation hub connecting the south, became an abandoned project isolated outside the railway network. Passing through the brand new gate, looking inside and out, from rows of wooden benches to the station lounges crowded with people in every corner, Anson felt a strange sense of familiarity. Following the endless stream of people and the signs on the walls, this was his first time taking a train, and he found the ticket gates in front of the platform as easily as a regular customer of such places. Snap! The young man in the black and white uniform tore off the ticket, stamped it, and handed it back to Anson with a formulaic smile. "Welcome aboard the Iron Sky Steam Train. This train is traveling from Oaktown Station to the Central West Station of the Royal Capital, without stopping at any stations along the way. Your seat is in the third compartment of carriage 10, by the window. We will provide you with complimentary lunch and dinner during the journey. The train attendant will inform you of the meal times, at which time you can go to the dining car to eat. If you would like to prepare gifts for your family or friends, Please don't worry. There are mobile shops along the train selling local specialties and souvenirs from this train. Rest assured, everything is of good quality and reasonably priced, carefully selected for you and all passengers. The train will pass through many areas of the central province, including famous rivers, rural fields, and hilly valleys. You can enjoy the scenery from the window to your heart's content. If you have any questions, please ask the staff for help. We will do our best to make your journey as comfortable as possible. After reading this long string of words, the young man, maintaining an unwavering smile, looked at Anson with his hands crossed in front of him. Excuse me." After opening his mouth several times, Anson finally got a chance to speak and breathed a sigh of relief. He asked impatiently, "Has anyone come here recently to inquire about or wait for passengers? Or could you tell me who else is in my compartment?" According to Carl Bain, Ludwig had arranged for someone to travel with him, but he hadn't seen the person the other was talking about yet. The young man in uniform, standing ramrod straight, smiled at him but didn't say anything for a full minute. Okay, thank you, you've been a great help." Anson roughly understood what was going on and forced a smile. He picked up his suitcase and headed straight for the train platform. Almost as soon as he left, the young man's enthusiastic voice rang out behind him again, "Welcome aboard the Iron Sky steam train. This train is traveling from Oaktown Station to the Royal Capital Central West Station, following the passageway through the ticket gates, down a series of stairs, and through a baggage check that was practically non-existent." Anson arrived at the platform and headed straight for the rear of the train. Some common sense about this world, or rather this era, is completely opposite to that of his previous life. The more luxurious the carriage, the further back it is. First-class seats and the private compartments of royalty and nobility are often located at the very back of the train. Glancing around at the increasing number of passengers on the platform, Anson cautiously took out his pocket watch. 11:45. Whoosh whoosh whoosh, almost simultaneously, a sharp and loud whistle sounded from afar. The steel train, gleaming with bright yellow gaslights and spewing thick white steam, came to a steady stop with a series of loud clanging sounds and the metallic scraping of wheels against the rails. In an instant, passengers on the platform either stood motionless, coughing lightly and continuing to read their newspapers, or were terrified, screaming and scrambling for their lives, or simply knelt on the ground, trembling and praying to God, or seized the opportunity to pick up the bags of those fleeing and quietly slip away under the cover of thick smoke. Cries, screams, escape, composure. The platform, shrouded in thick steam, suddenly became more bustling than the market in Oaktown. Uniformed, smiling staff patrolled the platform nonchalantly, seemingly oblivious to the scene before them, as if they had witnessed it countless times. In the thick white steam, Anson hesitated for a second, looking at the train door before him, before stepping into the train. Just then, an incredibly excited, slightly childish voice called out to him, stopping him in his tracks. Anson. Chapter 61 on the train. May 23rd, 90th year of the saintly calendar. This is a day I will never forget. The letter of recommendation sent by the dean has received a reply. St. Isaac's College has accepted my application. I, the youngest son of the Bach family, am going to the capital. June 10th, the capital city of Clovis. Its grandeur far exceeded my imagination. The Central Railway Station, the King's Theatre, the frozen lake, Clovis Cathedral, St. Isaac's College, everything before my eyes was breathtaking. Shock and astonishment were insufficient to describe my feelings. My heart was filled with the urge to kneel and pray, praising the miracle created by the Ring of Order. I suddenly remembered the question I asked my brother at dinner the night before my departure: just how great was Isaac Rand, who was murdered and then canonized by the Church of Order? That day, my brother, whom I considered all-knowing, showed hesitation for the first time. He changed everything. So my brother, after much hesitation, said, "Only after seeing it with my own eyes did I truly understand my brother's hesitation. Anyone who sees Clovis will understand the greatness of St. Isaac, and will be awestruck by the city he created, in the far north of the icy sea." Sailors who commanded sailing warships established colonies across the sea. In the south, where mountains and hills abound, people of our blood have long been incorporated into the kingdom. In the east of the grasslands, swamps, and forests, valiant cavalry and ancient elves have acknowledged the hegemony of the kingdom of Clovis. In the west, where the imperial banner shines, more and more free cities and duchies extend olive branches of friendship. Clovis, the heart of all this glory. This is an era of wisdom and faith, a season of light and hope. A path to heaven and change. The professors of the academy and the newspapers on the streets all agree that the greatness of this era and Clovis can only be expressed with a superlative adjective. This is the best of times, this is my time. Gently closing the diary, a slightly weary Anson withdrew his gaze and carefully placed the former Anson's diary into the outer pocket of his coat. From the moment he left the military camp, he began planning his next steps, finding a stable job and figuring out how to deal with the Black Mage and his underground evil organization. The first wasn't difficult. As a graduate of a military academy, the biggest benefit was guaranteed job placement. During wartime, the unemployment rate for officers was 0. Even if the army deliberately shunned him because of his betrayal by joining the Church of Order, Anson knew that an army lieutenant colonel's monthly salary was similar to that of a church academy tutor, enough to support daily life. Oh, and there was also the withholding of military pay and Ludwig's New Year's gift of 1,000 gold coins check. The real trouble was the second. The Black Mage's professorship at St. Isaac's Academy had both advantages and disadvantages for Anson. The advantage was that the former Anson was very familiar with the academy, and finding him wouldn't be difficult. The trouble lies in the fact that he is also thoroughly known by the other side, meaning that his every move in the capital cannot escape their notice. From the moment he sets foot in the capital, he must be prepared for the other side to come looking for him. An organization that is willing to interfere in war for a so-called grand plan is probably not a law-abiding citizen, is it? Gazing at the scenery rushing past a window, Anson's expression was thoughtful. As a new model of the 97th year of the St. Calendar, the passenger and freight train, equipped with the most advanced steam core of the Order Church, boasts direct travel and speed as its biggest selling points. Even without refueling or replenishing water along the way, it can travel from Oaktown to the capital at a speed of 90 km per hour. If needed, it can even reach a speed of 150 km per hour, 3 times that of the best war horses. But it's still a bit slow, Anson muttered to himself, his gaze involuntarily turning to his side. The little girl, her eyes wide with fear, was still pressed against the car window, peering out. Almost from the moment she boarded, she had been filled with a mixture of curiosity and dread about this completely different world, constantly bombarding him with these perplexing questions. After racking his brains to understand her overly succinct words, Anson roughly grasped the whole story. The day after the siege of Thunderberg ended, Ludwig began the demobilization of the new recruits. Although he didn't want to, the reality was that the Thunderberg conscription army, having suffered heavy losses from capturing a fortress already hollowed out by falsified accounts and corruption, simply couldn't maintain its current strength. Lisa August, she was one of those being demobilized. While it was somewhat cruel, Anson understood, no matter how unorganized the conscription army seemed, it was truly strange to take in, or even appoint, a little girl shorter than a rifle as a skirmisher company commander. But after learning that Lisa was the skirmisher company commander he had appointed, the brigadier general clearly overthought things. Not only had he prepared train tickets, but he had also specifically asked her to wait for him at the station a day in advance. Well, that certainly fit his personality of liking to surprise people. Anson, Lisa, her expression a mixture of fear and excitement, reluctantly turned back to Anson, withdrawing her gaze from the train window. Where are we going? The capital. Where's the capital? Nowhere in particular. The capital is Clovis City. Oh, Lisa suddenly realized, and Clovis City is the capital, and the capital, Clovis City, and Clovis City. Just when he thought this conversation would go on forever, the door to the compartment was suddenly pulled open. A young man with a thin, but well-proportioned, and rather disheveled face walked in. He wore a slightly worn light-colored trench coat, a poorly tied tie with misaligned buttons, trousers that dragged on his heels, and fiery red hair tied haphazardly in a ponytail. Even the slovenly recruit in the trenches looked more like a gentleman. Excuse me, I got on the wrong carriage," the young man explained with a forced smile, struggling to shove his tattered leather suitcase onto the overhead rack. The train staff and I looked at my ticket, but strangely, no matter how I explained, they wouldn't believe I bought a second-class ticket, and they almost arrested me as a thief. Well, that shows they were quite professional. Anson, completely at a loss for words, maintained a polite smile as he watched the still complaining young man. Lisa sat quietly beside Anson, hands clasped behind her back, obediently seated in the armchair. Like a ragdoll cat seeing a stranger suddenly enter its home. "Let me introduce myself, my name is Draco Veltz," the young man, smiling and chatting casually, straightened his back, crossed one leg, and placed his hands on his knee. My profession is writing travelogues and biographical novels for the local newspaper, traveling around, and occasionally handling minor troubles for people who need help. I'd say I'm a novelist and, oh, what's that word in the newspaper again? Detective. Detective. Anson raised an eyebrow slightly, smiling and feigning curiosity. Yes, but mainly a novelist. The smiling young man pulled a crumpled card from the pocket of his worn trench coat, holding it between two fingers and handing it over. I'm currently gathering material for a new novella for the Crovey Truth newspaper. This is my business card, so it's an honor to meet you, Lord Anson Bach of the Thundercastle conscript. In that instant, Anson's pupils constricted, reflecting Draco Veltz's shrewd eyes and the slightly surprised curve of his lips. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 62 Novelist. Excuse me. Mr. Draco, how did you know my name? In that instant, Anson, still smiling, raised the corners of his mouth, his right hand unconsciously moving towards the pistol at his waist, while simultaneously trying to shield Lisa, who sat obediently beside him. From the time he left the military camp until he boarded the train, he had only registered his name once at the inn in Oakshire. The badge identifying him as a graduate of the academy had long since been hidden in his coat's lining, and the train ticket in his hand was an anonymous one bought by Ludwig. Aside from his military uniform under his trench coat, there was nothing that could identify him. Anson, who remembered all of this clearly, writing in his diary every night, after discovering that his bloodline power could cause amnesia, he had resumed this good habit he had developed before. Under these circumstances, for a complete stranger to casually mention his name, even if the possibility of danger was small, Anson had to be on high alert. I'm so sorry, it's just a professional habit. Draco, taken aback by the question, chuckled and waved his hands repeatedly at the two people opposite him. Like I just said, I'm a travel writer, so observing and understanding current events is almost instinctive for me. Your uniform and overcoat, while unmarked, have clearly visible bloodstains and mud marks. If an active duty officer were on the train from Oakshire to the capital, I can't think of anyone other than a conscript from Thunder Keep. Of course, we can't completely rule out coincidences. An officer who has just finished his leave might have taken a detour through Oakshire to catch this train, so we need further evidence to determine his identity. Draco lowered his right leg and glanced at Lisa, who was quietly staring at him. Your clothes have no markings, but this lovely lady is wearing an obviously ill-fitting junior officer's uniform. I suspect you two are quite close, so this is likely your old clothes. My conclusion is that you are likely still, or were, a promising young army captain. Then there's your age. You look too young. A junior officer, recently graduated between 22 and 25, is unlikely to be in a second-class compartment in Iron Sky. That ticket would be too much of a burden on your salary. Draco, raising an eyebrow, shook his head. If you were in a hurry, you wouldn't have specifically chosen a comfortable second-class compartment. If it was for enjoyment, then it contradicts my previous assessment. So, your image came to mind, a promising young officer, possibly having served in the recruiting force at Thundercastle, currently needing to get to the capital as quickly as possible, and financially well off. Then, I remembered a report I saw in Oakshire. The recruiting force captured Thundercastle, and a lieutenant colonel promoted before the war led an infantry regiment in a daring surprise attack to capture the main fortress. Draco's smile deepened as he placed a business card on the table by the window and gently pushed it toward Anson with his index finger. This officer's name is Anson Bach. Anson, his pupils reflecting the other man's slightly smug expression, wore a calm facade masking 1,000 turbulent emotions. He subtly accepted the business card, his gaze quickly sweeping over it. Mr. Draco, do you instinctively observe everyone you meet like this? I'm a writer, it's part of my professional ethics. Draco shrugged with a smile. Of course, most of the time I restrain my desire to perform. The newspapers really coin new words these days. In fact, even if you wanted to hit me right now, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Similar things have happened quite a few times. Oh, so you do have some self-awareness after all? The more important reason is that I've been researching for my next book recently, so I sometimes inevitably act a little too impulsively. Draco, looking apologetic, pressed his hat to his chest and nodded sincerely. If this has caused you any inconvenience, Please accept my apology. I swear in the name of the Ring of Order that even if you wanted to hit me right now, I would never fight back. I almost shot you." Anson, trying to ease the tension, casually asked, "You said you're researching for the truth about Clovis. What kind of novel is that?" Draco was initially startled, then broke into a bright, sunny smile. "You've read the truth about Clovis?" "Oh, I have. What was your impression?" "Impression?" Anson frowned, recalling for a moment, "The masses, you flatter me." Draco shook his head, his trembling shoulders as if desperately trying to suppress a laugh. "Twaddled street news, poorly made short stories, scandals of important figures, all sustained by headlines and gimmicks. It's a failure as a newspaper, but a success as reading material. Its sales are so good that many newspapers have tried to imitate it, and all have failed, because the pleasure of truth lies not in facts, but in the story." Smiling, Draco crossed his right leg again and snapped his fingers. "To put it more bluntly, it lies in people. The era we live in is boring, so people are full of curiosity," Draco said happily. "For example, is our meeting today not a coincidence? Or even further, as you guessed, is it that I went to great lengths to follow you here?" Anson, still smiling, had an eyelid twitch involuntarily. "Really?" Lisa, who had been quiet all along, suddenly stuck her little head out and asked with wide eyes. "That's not important," Draco shrugged. "I'm a novelist. I chase stories, I serve my readers. Nobody cares about the truth, they only care about what happens next. For example, continuing our conversation, I've revealed your identity to the readers, but the reason for your sudden departure from the army for the capital, and the beautiful, lovely lady beside you, remains a mystery. I'm going to the military academy to collect my graduation certificate." After a moment's hesitation, Anson decided to tell a small lie he wasn't afraid of being found out about. "As for her, she's my sister, Lisa Bach." Lisa's eyes widened slightly, and she seemed about to speak, but the next second she obediently and quietly returned to her seat. Draco's eyes flickered, and a look of sudden realization dawned on him. "I see. I've thought of a good story, but it still needs some polishing. Well then, I'm going to check out today's menu in the dining car. We can discuss it in detail at lunchtime. Hopefully, it will bring a smile to your faces." With that, Draco stood up, opened a private compartment door, exchanged a few more polite words, and then turned to walk towards the carriage aisle. Watching his departing figure, Anson, with slightly complicated feelings, breathed a sigh of relief. Lisa, standing beside him, glanced at the closed compartment door. Then did Anson, slowly releasing his right hand from the gun handle behind his back, her little head tilted. She thought intently for a minute, then leaned closer with her innocent, wide eyes. "Anson, do you need Lisa to help you take down that guy?" Chapter 63. The beginning of the story. Faced with Lisa's concern, Anson could only smile and express his gratitude, while solemnly promising that he would not stop her if necessary. Recalling her demeanor in front of the novelist named Draco, Anson vaguely felt that the little girl beside him seemed somewhat different from when they first met. The Lisa he remembered would never have quietly waited for him in a crowded train station, as if nothing had happened, nor would she have so easily uttered words like "kill someone." Had something happened that he didn't know about during his resurrection? Anson, pondering this, looked out the train window at the scenery, intending to write it down in his diary before resting that night. Because the talkative novelist wasn't there, the next few tens of minutes of the journey were quite peaceful. Idly, he even examined the business card the other party had handed him. The crumpled card only contained the other person's name, occupation, and the address of the Clo Truth newspaper. A worn-out leather suitcase, an old coat, crumpled business cards. Would a freelance writer who writes second-rate biographies for lower-middle-class newspapers, unable to afford even a decent suitcase and a new coat, specifically choose a second-class compartment? Anson, somewhat perplexed, couldn't help but try to think like the other person, subconsciously pulling out his pocket watch. 11:10, 20 minutes until mealtime on the train. He just said he was going to the dining car to check out today's lunch menu. Lisa, the little head that had been peering out the window tilted back. "Stay in your compartment and don't move around. I'll go buy you a cake." "A cake?" Lisa's eyes lit up. "Is it one of those pretty, sweet things called canned fruit? That stingy Carl only gave me one the day I left." "Something like that." Anson touched her forehead, stood up, and placed the pocket watch in front of Lisa, who was squinting in enjoyment. "See the dial? When the long hand reaches 6, I'll be back, okay? Until then, no matter who knocks, Even if it's a flight attendant bringing meals, don't open the door, understand? Yes, sir. Lisa took the pocket watch, her face serious, and gave him a very solemn military salute. Anson nodded, buttoned up the top 3 buttons of his coat, slightly concealing his uniform underneath. After confirming that the compartment door was locked from the inside, he walked towards the dining car with peace of mind. From his position to the dining car were only 2 carriages, 11 and 12, and the aisle was deserted, because the Iron Sky provided catering service to first and second class carriages. The spacious and bright carriages were only occupied by men of similar age and dressed in similar suits, sitting by the window smoking and chatting, or somewhat decadently drinking alone at the bar. No women. And there was no sign of the novelist who claimed he was going to the dining car to check out the menu. It really isn't surprising at all, Anson muttered to himself, walking towards the bartender. Considering he had been detected by the blood mage Krog in Thunderhold, he didn't use his supernatural ability to search directly. Although the chances were slim, spellcasters who worshipped the old gods were key targets of the Church of Order's surveillance, and even if they were discovered, they wouldn't dare expose themselves in broad daylight. Including Anson himself. A glass of rum, oh. And a piece of cake, please. Having had experience negotiating with a flight attendant before, Anson smiled at the bartender as he took out his money. And may I ask you a small question? What brand of rum? The neatly dressed bartender, wearing a top hat, turned around, as if he hadn't heard Anson's last sentence. Navy Special. Anson shrugged slightly. That was the only brand he knew. Glancing at the army officer's uniform under his overcoat, the somewhat surprised bartender nodded and turned to his back without turning around. 3 silver coins, a piece of cake, and a glass of Tirpitz rum on the rocks for this gentleman. A few dozen seconds later, a glass of dark red liquid with ice cubes was placed in front of him, the square ice cubes taking up at least a third of the glass. I should have asked for no ice. What a shady businessman's trick. With a smile, Anson placed 6 silver coins under the tray of his glass. I'm looking for someone. Who? The waiter, unperturbed, wiped the bar, and in the blink of an eye, the silver coins on the table vanished. A friend, Anson said, toying with his glass. His name is, bang, just as he opened his mouth, a loud crash slammed open the cart door. Smoke billowed, and the whispering cart fell silent. Anson, holding his glass, followed the waiter's gaze and glanced behind him out of the corner of his eye. 3 men in officer uniforms rushed into the cart. Their uniforms resembled those of the army, but with subtle differences. The cuffs didn't have the standard brass buttons of an army officer, but silver ones, and their right shoulders had accessories resembling those used on imperial uniforms to secure a single shoulder cape. While Anson was still taking stock, the 3 men had already come toward the bar. The leader stood directly beside Anson and glared fiercely at the waiter. A man with red hair and a ponytail is coming toward the food cart. Did you see him? The trembling waiter stared blankly. Did you see that? Speak. And no, the startled waiter shrank back, almost falling backward. No one like that comes to the dining car. Hearing this, the officer frowned, turned to exchange a glance with his 2 unpleasant-looking companions behind him, took a deep breath with some resentment, and slammed a bulging leather wallet onto the table. 20 gold coins. There are 20 gold coins in this wallet, the officer at the bar shouted loudly to the entire dining car, his cold gaze sweeping over every pair of eyes that were either evasive or prying. Draco Veltz, red hair, wearing a tattered light-colored coat. Who can tell us where this person is? In the name of the king, I swear, this wallet is his. In the blink of an eye, the atmosphere in the dining car changed slightly, but most people remained silent, pretending not to have heard anything. Anson, sitting next to the officer, continued to toy with a wine glass in his hand, his expression thoughtful. The agitated officer waited for 5 minutes, glanced at the trembling waiter hiding under the bar and the silent passengers in the carriage, snorted, grabbed his wallet, and hurried out of the dining car with 2 companions, heading towards the next carriage. No, something's not right. The novelist left his compartment around 10:50, it's 11:17 now. If he knew from the start that someone was after him, why did he linger in his compartment for so long? Anson took a sip of rum, his expression somewhat lost in thought. Just then, the waiter who had been trembling under the bar slowly rose, carrying a small piece of cake in his hands, and approached. Sir, your cake is ready. By the way, what were you about to ask? Nothing, Anson instinctively looked up, his words trailing off. Draco Veltz, dressed as a waiter, was smiling at him, holding the cake in his hands. Chapter 64 Opening the door. Knock, knock, knock. A crisp knock sounded from outside the private room. Lisa, who had been quietly sitting in her armchair, turned her gaze from the window and swung her legs towards the door. Who is it? There was a moment of silence outside, followed by a rustling sound in low-pitched whispers. Ahem. A slightly heavy middle-aged male voice rang out. Hello, we are the crew of the Steel Sky. Could you please open the door? We need to. Crew, Lisa exclaimed in surprise. Are you here to deliver lunch? Yes. The middle-aged man hesitated for a moment. So please, what are we having for lunch today? Lisa interrupted cheerfully. This time, the rustling outside the door was more pronounced after a long pause. There's garlic sausage, beef stew and tomato sauce, buttered bread, and oyster soup. Oh, all things Lisa has never eaten before. They sound delicious. Lisa clapped her hands excitedly. Her cheeks flushed, and she pouted, saying in a very embarrassed tone, but Lisa promised not to open the door. Could you leave the food outside? This time, there was complete silence outside the door. At the same time, the storage room and the kitchen behind the food cart was equally silent. Lord Draco Wilster, I think you owe me an explanation. Anson, with a kind expression, maintained at least some restraint, looking down at the novelist with a polite smile. Ha. I think so too. Draco, crouching in the corner with his hands on his head, forced a couple of dry laughs. His slightly trembling eyes kept scanning Anson's face and the gun barrel pointed at his forehead. So, where should we begin? The gun barrel slammed into his forehead. Two things, Anson said coldly. Why did you come to me, and who are those people? Let's talk about the first one, okay? Draco forced a smile and pursed his lips. I didn't deliberately seek you out, believe me, from the moment we met, I haven't told you a single lie. My name, my identity, my ticket, my purpose, it's all true, of course. I understand your current doubts and wariness. In a way, that's also my purpose. The cause and reason are complicated to explain, but simply put, I need your help. Not only that, I also need to make sure you really have the ability to help me. Don't hit me. I know I'll get beaten up for saying this, but it's true. If you were just an ordinary officer taking your family to the capital, I really wouldn't want to cause you any trouble, but it turns out you're not, right? Whether it's discovering problems from my movements and words, or your composure when facing those guys, you're not an ordinary person, and I, now, really, need the help of someone like you. This is outrageous, unreasonable, and absurd, but a dying man will grasp at any straw, won't he? He sniffled, his voice slightly choked, mainly because he'd spoken too quickly and was a little short of breath. Are you satisfied with this explanation? Anson, his expression indifferent, pondered for a few seconds. Second question, they are officers of the Royal Guard, Draco said quickly. The so-called Royal Guard is the most elite professional army in the Kingdom of Clovis. Of course, that was in the past. For the past 10 years or so, they have been responsible for the defense and security of the capital, spending most of their time maintaining street order and dealing with riots, belonging to, I know what they do, Anson interrupted him, suddenly firing another shot into his forehead. Then, Draco's mouth twitched in pain. To make a long story short, the security situation in the capital has been deteriorating in recent years, from barely passable at the beginning, to now, facing the city of Clovis with its 800,000 inhabitants. The Royal Guard is increasingly overwhelmed, so the Privy Council issued the City Public Management Act, preparing to disband the Royal Guard and form a more professional security force. But the Royal Guard doesn't intend to just wait to die. They've been looking for ways to prove themselves, or rather, to rebel. Looking up at Anson, Draco lowered his voice, and their method is to drag powerful figures into the mess, while simultaneously creating cases that can alarm the entire kingdom, making the new security force formed by the Privy Council scramble and forced to rely on them. Isn't this courting death? Anson blurted out after a moment of stunned silence. To blackmail powerful figures and stir up trouble during wartime, even if they can survive for now, isn't the person who made this decision afraid of being punished later? Who says otherwise? Draco sighed and shook his head. But a dying man will grasp at any straw, won't he? Anson ignored him and coldly continued, but what does all this have to do with you? Draco blinked and gave Anson a knowing smile. I'm a storyteller for the newspaper. I'm gathering material for my next story. I'm also an amateur detective. Another shot landed on his chin. If you talk like that again, I'll shove a gun in your mouth next time, Anson said bluntly. You have evidence of their extortion, and you know their next plan, Draco nodded vigorously. They're planning to stage a train robbery, from murder to robbery. The whole plot is there. Remember those 3 officers? According to the script, they'll be the first witnesses in this case. As for me, hey, just a scapegoat, huh? Anson nodded. It wasn't hard to guess. Draco chuckled self-deprecatingly a few times, then silently exhaled, his expression gradually hardening as his smile faded. Your Excellency Anson Bach, I know how excessive my actions were, and I know you have no obligation to help me, so if you truly don't want to get involved, you can simply stand by. With your abilities and your status as an army officer, the Royal Guard won't do anything to you. My briefcase is on the luggage rack in your compartment, containing all the evidence I've collected regarding the Royal Guard's extortion. They will definitely come looking for it. You just need to pretend you know nothing and hand the briefcase to them. Spreading his hands, Draco sighed and lowered his head. Anson, however, was stunned. You just said, you put all the evidence in that box. Yeah, that's right, and then they'll come looking for it, probably? As long as they're not completely stupid, although they already are. Draco sighed and looked up weakly at Anson, who seemed to be in deep trouble. What's wrong? A few minutes later, Anson, dragging Draco along, rushed back to the private room. Then he realized he was too late. The door to the private room creaked open, and 2 burly men in worn-out coats lay sprawled inside. Beside them was Lisa, arms crossed, fuming. Seeing the 2 figures outside, Lisa's eyes lit up with surprise and a hint of smugness. Anson, you're back. These guys, they lied to Lisa. Tried to force their way into the room, and even tried to capture her, so Lisa killed them all. Chapter 65 Turning Point. Lisa, sitting by the window, hummed an unknown tune, carefully scooping a small piece of cake from the cake with her fork, her expression and movements as if handling a precious treasure. The creamy white frosting gently brushed her lips, a faint fruity aroma lingering in her nose. The sponge-like cake melted in her mouth with a sweet, crumbly crust of eggs and sugar, slowly melting away. Lisa, her mouth full of cream, squinted her eyes in bliss. The 2 people sitting next to her frantically spent over 10 minutes cleaning up the body, then sat down face to face, panting. So, what do you plan to do, Draco? His forehead bruised and swollen, forced a dry laugh, his eyes cautiously fixed on Anson, who was deep in thought. It's very embarrassing to say this, but we're in the same boat now. Oh, I should say, in the same compartment. Of course, you can still pin the blame for those 2 deaths on me. That's fine. It's human nature. I understand. I was already prepared for that before I did it. Shut up. Fine. Draco leaned back in his chair, head bowed, and remained silent. Anson, lost in thought, was deeply conflicted. He desperately wanted to shoot the novelist in front of him, but reason told him that even if he did, the guard's officers wouldn't let him go, especially now that he was an insider. They were even less likely to let him off. How many guardsmen were on the train? Not entirely sure, but probably between 10 and 13. That's the minimum you need to control 1 or 2 carriages and cause trouble, Draco answered immediately, glancing at the 2 corpses tucked under the seats. Of course, there are probably less than 10 now. Most of them are lying in wait in the 2 third-class carriages. Only the 3 officers and those killed by the esteemed Miss Lisa are free to move around. They didn't set a specific time or carriage for their operation, because it was just a spur-of-the-moment plan, but I think the dining car and our carriage number 10 are the most likely. As for the reasons, I won't go into details, because the novelist who stole their extortion plan is currently in carriage number 10. Looking at Draco's constant fawning smile, Anson felt his lips twitch again. He reached for his pocket watch on the table. The ticking hands had just passed 11:40. If I remember correctly, those 3 guards officers left the dining car at 11:15. Anson raised an eyebrow and looked at Draco again. How long does it take to go from the front third-class carriage to the dining car and back? 50 minutes. As if he had already guessed that Anson would ask this, Draco answered with a wry smile. Actually, if nothing unexpected happened, this was my original plan, to sneak into the front third-class carriage, deliberately get caught by the attendant as a thief, find a moment to take out the second-class compartment ticket, and while the attendant was checking it, use the time difference to avoid the guard search, and return to this compartment safely. But I didn't expect that there was a guard among the attendants. The waiter I switched, he almost recognized me. Even more unexpectedly, they knew my seat number, and then, you know what happened next? Yes, I know everything, and I also discovered that you have a special suicide technique. Suppressing the urge to roll his eyes, Anson let out a long sigh. 50 minutes. He had at most 50 minutes to figure out how to handle this situation. The Royal Guard's goal was to stage a train robbery, and for that, they needed a scapegoat to take the blame and die on the train. If he really wanted to help this troublemaker, there were essentially two approaches. The first was to sneak up and eliminate the Royal Guard officers before they could act. Killing wouldn't make the trouble disappear, but it would make the troublemakers disappear. The second was to go along with their plan. Since they wanted to cause trouble, he'd help them make it even bigger. Suppressing the urge to bury himself in writing a draft, Anson already had a rough idea. All right. I can help you. Before Draco could even show a hint of joy, Anson coldly interrupted, but before that, you have to tell me one more thing. Why would a writer who wrote novels for second-rate mass-market newspapers and couldn't even afford a new coat and briefcase go against a Royal Guard, who controlled the security of the capital? Want to create a big news story? He already has the story and the dirt on him. As for evidence, this world and era are different from Anson's previous life. Newspapers don't need oaths to publish news. Spreading rumors and slander is the bare minimum of professional ethics. Money? He's even got the extortion evidence. How could he not get the money? So what exactly was his purpose? Revenge. Draco smiled casually. I want revenge on the Royal Guard. 2 months ago, I received a job offer from the Crovey Truth newspaper, along with their recent issues. In the October 22nd issue, they published a story of a very unfortunate accident. A young man, on the streets where he usually hangs out, encountered a robbery. In a moment of impulsiveness, he rushed in, subdued the robber, and was cut on the calf by a sharp weapon. Just as he was about to leave, clutching his wound, he was mistaken for the robber by the Royal Guard, who had called for help and shot dead on the spot. Afterwards, the Royal Guard soldiers were punished, and the young man was blamed for being in the dangerous area, and the matter was hastily closed. A rather regrettable story. Draco blinked, looking at the thoughtful Anson. Victim, robber, young man, soldier. Of the 4 people in the story, who is the murderer? The victim who called for help? He was just trying to save himself. The robber? In the capital these days, even people with legitimate jobs rob others, otherwise they can't survive. The soldier? He didn't know what happened. He only saw one person lying on the ground, another injured, and someone holding something in their hand. As for the young man, he's probably the only one of the 4 who has the right to say he's innocent. Draco's lips curled into a smile, but his eyes grew even sharper. None of them are the murderers. The Royal Guard, powerless against the chaotic security situation in the capital. This outdated organization is the murderer, disrupting the plans, restoring order to the capital city of Clovis, allowing 800,000 people to live in a city where they don't have to live in constant fear, always ready to rob others or be robbed. That's my revenge. As he finished speaking, Draco sat up straight, crossed his right leg, placed his hands on his knee, and met Anson's gaze. By the way, that young man's name is Miller Veltz, my last remaining relative in this world, but you've probably already guessed it. This is my purpose and reason, Your Excellency Anson Bach. I know my actions are excessive and rude, I know their entire plan, but frankly, I have no ability to escape from them, let alone stop them. I need your help, not without compensation, of course. Very well, Anson sighed, raising his head slightly, but Your Excellency Draco Veltz, just in case, I'll ask for a very high price. Chapter 66 Behind the Scenes. Missing, in the spacious, brightly lit first-class compartment, a middle-aged man in a black trench coat and scarf, wearing a top hat, looked at the officer opposite him with amusement. Captain, did I hear you correctly? You 12 men, with the informants, funds, and intelligence I provided, let a powerless newspaper writer disappear on a steam train with nowhere to escape. No, we didn't. The stammering captain buried his head in his chest, the soft, comfortable sofa seat beneath him now making him feel like he was sitting on pins and needles, fine beads of cold sweat constantly seeping from his temples and forehead. Nothing. The middle-aged man's tone was irritated. We didn't lose him. The captain, mustering his courage, suddenly looked up. In fact, we've pinpointed his exact location. Oh, the middle-aged man, feigning surprise, raised an eyebrow and pulled a pipe and matches from his pocket. Tell me about it. Throughout the search, from the dining car to the last third-class carriage, I left a sentry post in every carriage we passed, ensuring that if the target were hiding on the train, he would immediately be exposed to our sight. Seeing the other man's interest, The captain, who had just been trembling with tension, immediately became excited and righteous. After checking each carriage, we can basically confirm that the target is not in any of the carriages after the dining car. In fact, he may have stayed in a certain carriage from the very beginning and never left, which is why he managed to evade our thorough search. Based on my judgment, he is most likely in compartment number 3 of carriage number 10. The middle-aged man nodded expressionlessly. Continue, The captain was taken aback. Continue what? The middle-aged man, who was biting his pipe hard, asked in a slightly sarcastic tone. Since you already know the exact location of the target, why are there only the two of us in this room? This is mainly because I had to come and report to you in advance, the captain explained. Oh, so it's all because of me that you couldn't catch the target immediately? Yes, the captain nodded instinctively, then turned pale with shock. No, that's not it. I arranged for 2 of my most capable subordinates to go to compartment number 3 of car number 10 to carry out the arrest operation before the search began. I just don't know why. They haven't returned to report yet. Who? The middle-aged man exhaled a long breath, blowing a puff of smoke into the captain's face. Cough, cough, cough. The captain struggled to hold it in, but soon his face turned red, and he lowered his head to cover his mouth and nose and practice coughing. But just as he lowered his head, he suddenly felt a force press hard on the back of his neck. Bang! Caught completely off guard, the captain's face slammed hard onto the mahogany dining table covered with a velvet tablecloth. Crack! The captain, his nose broken, didn't even have time to cry out before blood mixed with broken teeth gushed from his mouth. He collapsed backward to the ground, looking in terror at the indifferent-faced middle-aged man. Sir, the answer he received was a powerful kick from the middle-aged man, piercing straight into the captain's abdomen. I've had enough of your incompetence and your shameful habit of making excuses. Looking down at the captain, who was convulsing on the floor like a worm, the middle-aged man with a pipe reached for his cane from beside the sofa and pressed it coldly against the captain's forehead. I can tolerate a capable but excuse-prone subordinate. I can tolerate a loyal idiot, but I cannot tolerate a traitor who is both idiotic and prone to making excuses, causing my painstakingly crafted plan to go down the drain. Captain, you have fully proven yourself to be a moldy orange, so don't let me doubt your loyalty even for a second. From now on, I will be in charge of the entire plan, and you are only responsible for obeying orders. Understand? Yes. The captain, his mouth full of blood, nodded repeatedly, his terrified expression showing no hesitation. Very good. The middle-aged man, too lazy to even glance at him again, disdainfully tossed aside his blood-stained cane, lazily settling on the sofa to enjoy the smell of tobacco. He pulled a silver-plated pocket watch from the inside pocket of his coat. 10 minutes. In 10 minutes, recall all your men planted on the Iron Sky. Until Draco Veltz is captured, the hijacking plan is temporarily cancelled. Focus all your efforts on finding the briefcase he's carrying. It contains crucial evidence of the Royal Guard's bribery and extortion of Privy Council members. If it's exposed, the entire Royal Guard's fate will be far more than just disbandment. Yes, sir. The captain, his face covered in blood, struggled to his feet, not forgetting to pick up the cane he had thrown on the ground. He carefully wiped it clean with his sleeve, offering it to the captain with fawning hands. But sir, if the hijacking plan doesn't go smoothly, what will happen to the Privy Council? That's none of your business. With a cold snort, the middle-aged man snatched the cane from him, glancing disdainfully at the trembling face. First of all, I've never approved of this foolish plan from the start, to rob the Iron Sky, have the guards take full charge of the case, and prevent the Privy Council from immediately taking action to dismiss it. It sounds pretty good, but what if the Privy Council refuses to let the guards handle the case? What if the royal family decides not to side with the guards, but instead appeases the nobles and hands the case over to some nobody unrelated to it? This is a matter of life and death for the entire guards. We must not place our hopes on a far-fetched train robbery. If the Privy Council is really going to take action against us, then we must let them see the price they will have to pay. Holding his pipe in his right hand, the middle-aged man's cold lips suddenly curled slightly. Captain, have you ever heard of the name Ludwig Franz? The captain, who had been looking down, cautiously raised his gaze. You mean Archbishop Luther's son? That's right, him. The middle-aged man nodded slightly. Looking out the window, he won a victory at Thunderberg that exceeded everyone's expectations, recapturing that crucial fortress for the Southern Legion in 19 days. Soon, news of his victory will arrive in the capital on this train. causing a huge uproar. Right, with an archbishop as his father, his prestige in the capital will reach unimaginable heights, and the entire France family will advance further. The army will have no reason to suppress him anymore. But I've heard some very interesting rumors, the middle-aged man sneered. This astonishing victory might not be as simple as it seems. There's a high possibility that some old gods faction is mixed in with Ludwig Franz's army. Old gods, the shocked captain blurted out. Knock knock knock. Just then, a crisp knock sounded on the compartment door. The silent middle-aged man remained silent, while the captain, clutching his wound, turned around and pressed the doorknob with a somewhat resentful gaze. The moment the door opened, a slightly thin young man with black hair and brown eyes appeared smiling before him. The captain, who had been frowning, was taken aback at first, then his face showed a look of astonishment. You're the one from the dining car, thud. Before he could finish speaking, the smiling ensign plunged a bayonet into his throat. Author's note on the launch of Chapter 67. This was a slightly surprising thing for Kong Kong, because he really didn't expect it to be published after only 180,000 words. Too early. There's still so much background story to write. The whole plot has only just begun. And it's already published, cough cough. Anyway, Kong Kong is very aware of his fate as a struggling writer, and is very grateful to so many readers who have supported him from the wizard from afar to this book. Kong Kong has even seen readers of the knight's pleasant journey. How to put it, his gratitude is beyond words. For those sincere readers who are willing to support Kong Kong in writing more and better stories, there's no other way to thank them except to continue writing. So, for tomorrow's first chapter, he hopes everyone will actively subscribe, reward, recommend, and favorite, laughs and cries. Also, here's a little explanation. Kong Kong has a little habit of using the names of some characters from the previous book in the next book, but in reality, there's no direct connection between the two characters or the two books. However, if you insist on saying so, there is indeed an indirect connection. For example, the East mentioned in Wizard's Rights is indeed the kingdom of Turin from the Knight's Pleasure Journey. And this book is similar. Kong Kong sometimes really likes to use references. Finally, to readers reading Kong Kong's books for the first time, please rest assured, regardless of the book's success, Kong Kong will strive to finish the story. This is a promise that will absolutely not disappoint readers, nor will it leave me with any regrets. In the first volume, The Siege, Kong Kong roughly introduces the world's beliefs, situation, and power system. In the second volume, Traces of the Storm, the ignited flames will burn even more fiercely, and the factions and forces hiding behind the scenes will emerge one after another. So, please look forward to it. I know Chapter 68 quite well. Almost instantly, the middle-aged man, unfazed by the captain's fall, reached his left hand inside his jacket and leaned back on the sofa, rolling gracefully under the long table. Thump. The next second, the bayonet that had pierced the captain's throat was firmly embedded in the wall at the end of the sofa. The middle-aged man lying under the table stared in shock at the still humping hilt, a bead of cold sweat trickling down his forehead. If he had hesitated even a second longer or lunged at the man, it wouldn't have been the wall of the private room that had been impaled. Having narrowly escaped death, the middle-aged man didn't hesitate. Gripping his revolver, he moved towards the other end of the long table opposite the door, trying to create distance from Anson who had rushed in. But then, through his vision under the table, he saw another figure standing outside the door. If he created distance, the two men could fire without regard for their comrade's safety, leaving him trapped inside the room with no chance of resistance until their bullets ran out. Clang! A slender wooden cane blocked the incoming military knife, producing a metallic clang. Looking at the strangely familiar style of the knife and the military uniform beneath the overcoat of the figure before him, the middle-aged man, his face showing surprise, blurted out, "You're an officer in the Royal Army." His response was another slash at a tricky angle, the cold blade piercing towards the middle-aged man's face like a venomous snake. Realizing he couldn't dodge in time, the middle-aged man immediately raised his cane to parry. The crisp clashes sounded like notes rapidly playing in the spacious private room as the middle-aged man, struggling to hold on, relentlessly parried. The attacks from the person before him were so swift and cunning that he couldn't even find space or room to counterattack. Clang! Another slash from a tricky angle struck the center of the cane, causing the middle-aged man's arm to jolt, almost causing him to drop his only weapon. But Anson gave him no chance to relax, brandishing his military knife and immediately closing in. His left hand, which had been behind his back, grabbing the handle of his cane. Clang, with the middle-aged man abruptly sliding backward to dodge, a blinding silver-white sword light erupted from the cane sword. A cane sword. Surprise. Noticing the fleeting surprise in Anson's eyes, the middle-aged man, a smirk playing on his lips, immediately lunged forward, the sword tip aimed directly at Anson's throat. Anson, having dropped his cane, immediately retreated to dodge, his knife seemingly becoming frantic. An opportunity. Seizing this momentary opening, the middle-aged man immediately launched a relentless attack on Anson, the sword tips raining down like a storm, forcing the elusive Anson to constantly dodge and parry. Each attack seemed like a fatal blow that could instantly kill him, and each attack was barely parried or dodged. The more the slender figure dodged, the more it fueled the middle-aged man's desire to attack. Thump. Anson, stumbling backward from the captain's corpse, slammed heavily against the door, nearly falling and locking his comrade out in the process. The middle-aged man, his eyes lighting up, rushed forward, kicking the captain's body aside. He forcefully smashed Anson's blade away with his cane sword, then thrust forward with deadly force. Anson, nearly falling, had nowhere to escape, standing frozen as the sword tip aimed straight for his throat. But in that instant, Anson abruptly stopped the smashed blade, as if it had come alive, aiming for the middle-aged man's chest. And the saber's blade was a third longer than the cane sword. The middle-aged man finally realized what was happening just before the blade pierced him, forcefully twisting his thrust into a sweeping attack that barely grazed Anson's coat collar, tearing a gash in it. Without time to think, he stepped to the side, his left hand, always hidden under his coat, drawing his sidearm. Clang, the thrusting blade suddenly flicked upwards, sending the bloodied revolver and the middle-aged man's index finger flying through the air. Thud. The next second, the middle-aged man, with the blade pressed against his throat, watched helplessly as his severed finger and sidearm fell to the ground. A gifted individual, the middle-aged man's face was extremely grim, his icy gaze fixed on Anson's face. I never thought that a dignified Royal Army officer who inherited the power of bloodline would actually become an assassin. Should I feel honored, or ashamed? Anson, who hadn't uttered a word, narrowed his eyes, his right hand, gripping the hilt of his knife, thrusting forward. At that very moment, snap, the middle-aged man, who had been surrendering, suddenly raised his bleeding left hand, gripping the hilt of the knife tightly just before the blade pierced his chest. Slightly startled, Anson exerted a little force, only to find the blade tip as if nailed into granite, completely unmoving. Surprised, the middle-aged man sneered. This was the second time he'd said this. Young man, I guess the person who taught you about bloodline power should have told you that the activation conditions for different types of bloodline power are completely different. For some special types, the conditions are even extremely demanding. Clang. The military knife tightly gripped in his hand was forcibly snatched away by the middle-aged man, becoming a blur and pinning him to the wall. The next second, the middle-aged man, wielding a cane sword, lunged at the unarmed Anson. Anson, tense all over, abruptly moved to the right, the blinding sword light grazing his cheek like an arrow. The middle-aged man, lunging forward, steadied himself, his slender right leg rising abruptly like a knight's sword, striking with pinpoint accuracy towards Anson's chest. Anson, caught completely off guard and unable to even parry, was kicked from one end of the private room to the other. His leaping figure tumbled across the dining table, leaving it a mess on the floor. Thump. A muffled sound followed as a disheveled Anson slumped against the wall of the room, the pain causing him to tremble and stirring up some less than pleasant memories. However, this time was slightly different. Seeing Anson unable to rise, the middle-aged man, sneering, brandished his cane sword and slowed his approach. Since this assassin was stupid enough to engage in a one-on-one duel, he would grant his wish. Anson, slumped on the floor, head bowed, gasped for breath, only his shoulders trembling slightly. The middle-aged man standing before him, like an executioner, pressed his cane sword against Anson's chest. Thud. The middle-aged man holding the sword shuddered, his incredulous gaze slowly falling. The bayonet nailed to the wall had somehow pierced his neck. Anson, head still bowed, held the bayonet in the same throwing motion with his left hand. Thump. The middle-aged man knelt before Anson, his left hand, throbbing with blood, trembling slightly as he reached for his throat where the bayonet had pierced, but the distance between his hand and the hilt seemed like an insurmountable chasm. Some special categories have extremely harsh conditions, Anson muttered to himself as he slowly rose, watching the still struggling man as he drew his sidearm from behind, the black muzzle plunging into the man's coat and pressing it against his heart. What a coincidence, I actually know quite a bit about this special kind of bloodline power. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 69, the beginning of the story. Isn't this different from what we agreed on at the beginning? Draco Veltz coughed twice, his expression somewhat embarrassed as he stood in the doorway. In the room, a scene of utter chaos. The middle-aged man's body lay in a pool of blood, his bulging eyes and gaping mouth seemingly still telling of his final moments of terror. At the other end of the compartment, the captain's body, also pierced through the throat by a bayonet, lay curled up, a long trail of blood gushing from his neck stretching from the doorway into the room. The heavy stench of blood mixed with a putrid smell of incontinence made Draco's stomach churn, and he desperately suppressed the urge to vomit. Initially, the two had devised several plans, deciding to adapt to the situation as it unfolded. The first option was to confirm the guard's deployment and the plans and preparations on the Iron Sky by eavesdropping, without entering the first-class compartment. The second option was to sneak into the compartment while the guard was away. The most dangerous place is often the safest, and if several key members of the guard could be temporarily incapacitated, the problem could be resolved without a trace. The third option was to rush in, take control of the compartment without causing a disturbance, and try to negotiate with the guard while taking action, persuading them with words or fists. The three options ranged from cowardly to reckless, and then the man in front of him chose the fourth. Why? Draco asked, barely suppressing his urge to vomit. For no reason, Anson snorted lightly, his tone flat without looking up. I changed my mind at the last minute. It's that simple. Killing won't make the trouble disappear, but it will make the troublemakers disappear. This middle-aged man and the captain who saw me in the dining car before were the executors of the entire operation on the Iron Sky. With them dead, the remaining guards officers are insignificant, and your biggest problem is solved. That seems to be the case. Draco nodded as he sat down on the sofa opposite Anson, his lips trembling slightly beneath his raised gaze. But it shouldn't be just because of these things, right? I want to know your real reason. No, you don't want to. Anson refused decisively, his calm gaze never leaving Draco's face. Because you already know, Draco chuckled dryly, remaining silent, neither admitting nor denying. The guards officers possessed intelligence that there were old gods members within the conscription force. Even just this suspicion alone was enough for Anson to prevent this major problem from leaving live. Judging from the intelligence Draco gleaned, the current royal guard was like a pack of starving rabid dogs, ready to pounce on anything that looked like a bone to survive. Under these circumstances, power and status posed no threat to them, and were even more attractive. After all, the more powerful figures were dragged down with them, the higher the chances of survival for the royal guard, already on the verge of being disbanded. As for Draco, Anson didn't intend to hide anything from him. The two were now in a cooperative relationship, and besides, deliberately denying it to a novelist who could discern his identity through mere observation would be tantamount to admitting it, but he didn't intend to tell him more. By the way, you still haven't told me how you knew this guy was in the first-class cabin on the Iron Sky. Anson deliberately changed the subject. I don't know. Draco's slight smile lightened the previously heavy atmosphere in the compartment, but for the guards, who are on the verge of being disbanded, this train heist is an utterly foolish yet crucial plan. If they were smart enough, they wouldn't have done it. If they took it seriously enough, they wouldn't have just sent a mere captain to be in charge of the whole plan. So I think there's at least one officer of a certain rank on this train in charge of the overall situation. If not, then it proves that the so-called train heist is just a target thrown out by the guards to lure some forces that want to take advantage of the situation. Draco spread his hands to the sides of the sofa, his smile deepening slightly. As it turns out, I was overthinking it. These guards, they're just a bunch of moldy oranges. Anson couldn't help but curl the corners of his mouth as well. As for why it's a first-class compartment, it's because it's at the very back of the train. So, unless this gentleman is the kind who'd stoop to hiding in third class, finding him won't be difficult at all. Draco glanced at the middle-aged man's corpse on the ground. You see, like I said before, I'm a novelist. I don't care about the truth at all, I only care about what happens next. Just like I don't care whether the incident that killed my last relative was really as the newspapers say, or whether it was to cover up some truth. He's dead, but his story has only just begun. I'm going to keep writing and give this unfortunate story a somewhat satisfactory ending. Too tragic a plot can affect newspaper sales. Draco blinked, a bright, sunny smile on his face. Anson, silently watching him, saw no sorrow or bitterness on that face. Enough with this small talk, let's discuss the next plan. Draco changed the subject. Lunchtime on the Iron Sky is noon, but it's 12:10 now, and there's still no movement from the dining car, so it's highly likely that the Guardians bribed someone to change the lunchtime. This will have one consequence. Hungry gentlemen and ladies will leave their compartments and come to the dining car to see what's going on, gathering 3 or 4 times more people than usual. They'll make noise, complain, chat with people from other compartments, and then order a drink and linger in the dining car for quite some time, leaning back on the soft sofa. Draco Veltz, like a storied elder by the fireplace, calmly and smilingly narrated the story yet to unfold. This is the Guardians' plan. Using this time difference, they only need to control the dining car to control most of the wealthy people on the Iron Sky, extorting money and creating a big scandal, and we can take advantage of that. You mean? Anson raised an eyebrow. I'll draw the attention of most of the people on the train, and you'll take care of the remaining guards on the Iron Sky, at least 9, according to them. Draco shrugged. Of course, it's not as simple as it seems. You'll be dealing with 9 highly trained professionals, and your only help is our innocent and lovely Miss Lisa Bach. She seems particularly reassuring, recalling a certain corpse shoved under a second-class compartment chair. The novelist stammered, his expression strange. Anson. Chapter 70 is a detective. At 1:15 p.m., a full hour and a half had passed since lunch service began on the Steel Sky. In the customs of the Kingdom of Clovis and indeed the entire Order world, breakfast was a relatively recent concept, described by the Clovis truth as the start of the day for the working class and the respectable class. For the truly respectable class, the day usually began with their first cup of coffee and a dark beer, with their first meal typically between 10 a.m. and 12 p.m. After a full hour of desperate restraint and maintaining decorum, and after exhausting all possible conversation topics, the hungry gentlemen and ladies finally began to lose their patience. To avoid making their purpose too obvious, the brilliant ladies would often knock on the door of the next compartment, inviting their neighbors, who had found it noisy just minutes before, to join them for lunch in the dining car, sharing this beautiful midday. Thus, spurred on by the gentlemen who couldn't refuse and the hospitable ladies, more and more guests from the first and second class compartments began moving towards the dining car. In the blink of an eye, the once calm dining car transformed into a bustling banquet hall. With all the tables and bars packed with passengers, the frantic flight attendants, sweating profusely, had to fumble for new chairs while explaining to the refined and easygoing gentlemen and ladies who had been yelling at them that lunchtime had been changed from 12 o'clock to 2 p.m. Anson, now dressed in a new coat and top hat, sat with his legs crossed, having deliberately chosen a quiet, secluded corner by the window where he wouldn't be easily noticed. He used the newspaper borrowed from Draco to cover his upper body, leisurely reading old news from almost a month ago. The security situation in the Eastern District of the capital continues to deteriorate, and martial law has been put on the agenda. The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Guard has once again protested to the Privy Council, stating that for the sake of all Royal Guard officers and soldiers and the security of the capital, the Urban Public Management Act is completely unacceptable, and proposed a large-scale expansion plan with a high budget, establishing a 10,000-strong light infantry corps in the capital. An attack occurred on Red Brick Street, where a group of desperate rioters attempted to storm Clovis Cathedral but were severely suppressed. The Commander-in-Chief of the Royal Guard stated that the rioters in the capital are mainly composed of gangsters, vagrants, beggars, unemployed workers, and bankrupt individuals, and indicated that the vast majority of them would be imprisoned, while a few with less serious offenses would be placed in welfare institutions. Anson, silent, scanned the various sections of the newspaper, while simultaneously, the scenes throughout the train carriage flashed through his mind. Soon, he found his target. A well-proportioned waitress in an apron was pushing an elegant dining cart with great difficulty through the crowd, moving towards the last first-class carriage of the train. Through the gaps in the newspaper, Anson glanced at the departing waiter out of the corner of his eye, a slight smile playing on his lips as he silently counted in his head 1, 2, 3, 66, 67, 68, 118, 119, 120. Eek. E. Car 12, Car 12, the last private room's guest, has been murdered. The waiter, who had rushed into the dining car without a second thought, collapsed to his seat, letting out a chilling scream directed at the ceiling. Instantly, the entire dining car seemed to have been doused with hot oil. The gentlemen and ladies who had been whispering just moments before now wore expressions of utter terror, their screams of fear and unease filling the air. Calm down. Gentlemen and ladies, please calm down. A man with graying hair and beard, dressed like a train conductor, stepped forward and shouted at the chaotic crowd, "I am the conductor of the Steel Sky, and I, and the crew will guarantee everyone's safety and property. In the name of the Ring of Order and my king, I assure you that we will do everything possible to ensure your safety and apprehend the perpetrator of this unfortunate incident as soon as possible. So now, ladies and gentlemen, please return to your compartments immediately, lock the doors, and do not let anyone in." Oh, like the guests in carriage 12, a discordant voice suddenly rang out in the dining car, interrupting the conductor who was still shouting. The conductor stared wide-eyed, both shocked and angry, at the figure in a tattered overcoat who had suddenly spoken at the bar. I'm just a cautious and timid passenger who wanted to ask you, the person in charge of our safety, a small question." The young man, who had interrupted again, pushed aside his wineglass, turned around with an extremely sincere smile, and looked at the obviously displeased train conductor. "Please tell me, given that you've only found the victim and have no evidence, how do you plan to catch the murderer?" The young man blinked, and suddenly everyone in the dining car turned their gaze to the startled and flustered train conductor, and the waiter slumped on the floor beside him, following his question. Your best solution." The young man suddenly raised his voice. "Of course, it's to seal off the scene as soon as possible, look for any evidence or traces that the criminal may have unintentionally lost, and at the same time, confirm the approximate identity and appearance of the murderer in the shortest possible time. But that's not enough, because you don't know who the murderer is. He could be anyone, he could impersonate anyone. Anyone who can just knock on the door and walk into the box could be the murderer, right? If we deduce from this point of view, then the person on this Steel Sky with the most opportunity to commit the crime is the flight attendant." In the deathly silent dining car, a particularly intelligent gentleman suddenly blurted out. "Exactly." The young man smiled slightly, looking at the train conductor who was trembling with anger. "So, for the safety of all passengers on this train, and for the safety and innocence of you and all the train crew, this not-so-likable fellow, have an immature suggestion, that is, let's all go to the last compartment of carriage 12, and in full view of everyone, investigate and find the culprit in this murder case, uncovering the truth. What do you think?" The sweating train conductor looked at the stares directed at him, then at the terrified, lifeless waiter on the floor, and the barely suppressed tension made him blurt out, Who are you?" Under everyone's gaze, the smiling young man pulled a crumpled card from the pocket of his worn-out coat, held it between two fingers, and handed it to the train conductor. "Please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Draco Veltz, and then, I'm a detective." 10 minutes later, aboard Anson put down his old newspaper. The food cart in front of him had vanished as if by magic, leaving only a few tables occupied. Lisa, sitting opposite him, had her hands and mouth covered in grease and food scraps, her round cheeks propped up by her hands, her eyes half closed in contentment. "Lisa, after you've eaten, how about we do some good, healthy warm-up exercises, okay?" Chapter 71 Blind Spot. Before we officially solve the case, I'd like to ask you all a small question. In the spacious first-class compartment, a smiling Draco picked up the dead middle-aged man's pipe from the floor, his expression natural as he looked at the 5 people before him, each with a different expression, chosen by the passengers as their representatives: the grim-faced train conductor, the dazed steward, the noblewoman struggling to hold back nausea with her husband, and an elderly nobleman wearing a top hat. How long can one usually smoke a pipe with such a large caliber? What does that have to do with solving the case? The conductor said impatiently. Draco, unfazed, didn't answer, instead extending the pipe towards the elderly nobleman in the top hat. Glancing at the surrounding gazes, the elderly gentleman, lightly pressing his hat brim, coughed softly. "It depends on the situation, but usually it's 1 to 2 hours." Draco nodded slightly, ignoring the bloodstains, and put his pipe in his mouth. With his hands in his coat pockets, he turned and walked towards the middle-aged man's body. There were 2 victims in this box. One was a captain from the army, who suffocated, the other was a gentleman clearly from the upper class, who bled to death. Both had something in common: their throats were pierced by a sharp weapon, and both had signs of being beaten. The gentleman had been shot 6 times in the chest, and his left index finger had been severed. The temperature of the bodies and the bloodstains tell us that neither had died more than 2 hours ago. Coincidentally, that's exactly the time it takes to smoke a pipe. In other words, the incident occurred about 2 hours ago. Draco suddenly stopped, turning to look at the 5 people behind him as he pulled a match from his pocket, lightly tracing it across the mouth of his pipe with a playful expression. The instant the victim lit his pipe, bang! A black lead bullet pierced precisely between the eyebrows of a guard officer. As if by telepathy, Anson rushed forward the moment the officer fell, grabbing his body and slamming it against the compartment door beside him. Thump! The next second, a burst of gunfire erupted like a tap dance, instantly riddling the officer's body with bullets. Click, click, in the suddenly silent train corridor, 2 faint sounds reached Anson's ears, one after the other. It was the sound of a revolver's magazine spinning. Without changing his expression, Anson pushed the body aside, his right-hand pistol aimed directly at the gun hole in the compartment door, and fired 2 shots without hesitation. A scream rang out from behind the door. This was the advantage of a spellcaster, an excellent sense of distance combined with the ability to see everything, completing all the calculations the instant he saw it. The rest was simply raising his hand and pulling the trigger. He's over here, flank him from the other side, hurry. Hurry. Damn it, I heard gunshots. Who is that guy? Who cares? We'll find out once we catch him. Impatient shouts and hurried, heavy footsteps rapidly approached Anson from both the front and back of the carriage. Anson kicked open the door and entered the compartment, reloading while waiting for them to flank him from both ends. Judging from the sounds, these guards hadn't realized their commander had been killed, and they had fallen into a carefully laid trap. They seemed to still think they had just unlucky enough to stumble upon another group of genuine carjackers, and that it was all just a coincidence. A coincidence, the astonished lady and her overly young husband blurted out. That's right, the whole case is a brilliant coincidence. Ladies and gentlemen, please look at the bloodstains under your feet. Draco, with a pipe in his mouth and his hands in his pockets, looked down at the dark red floor. It has told us everything that happened. The 5 people, their faces filled with horror, then noticed the bloodstains under their feet, which seemed to be parted like waves and moved toward the sides of the private room. Draco crouched down, pointing with his right hand, which held a pipe, to the crack in the compartment door. The bloodstains extended inwards from the doorway, indicating the assailant struck the victim the instant he opened the door. The middle-aged gentleman, smoking his pipe, heard a knock and mistook it for a train attendant or a passenger. Out of habitual instinct, he showed no suspicion towards the person outside, even lighting his pipe as he stood up, walking casually to the door and easily opening it. Then, the assailant pierced his throat with some sharp weapon. Turning to smile at the crowd, Draco slapped his neck hard with a smack. The lady and her young husband shuddered in shock. But for some reason, the victim did not die immediately and even put up a fight afterward. Draco continued in a low voice, pointing his pipe at the finger in the dry blood pool. In the midst of extreme shock and fear, our victim instinctively picked up the only item he had that could be used as a weapon to block the assailant's blade, and immediately had his left index finger severed, and that item was a pipe. The noblewoman, who had raised her hand to cover her mouth, exclaimed in surprise. Exactly, Draco nodded, answering in a slightly ambiguous tone. The victim tried to block the blade with his pipe, but unfortunately his left index finger was severed, and the pipe fell. I think that possibility exists. He stood up, pretending to look around for clues, while his gaze fell to the corner behind the sofa in the private room. The signs of a struggle and the cane sword on the floor prove that the victim, despite being extremely tense and having a finger severed, did not give up resisting, and even managed to injure the assailant. Unfortunately, the victim was clearly no match for the assailant. After a very brief period of resistance that went unnoticed, the assailant seized an opening and subdued him, shooting him 6 times in the chest while already wounded in the neck. Therefore, the victim did not suffocate from a pierced throat, but rather bled to death due to excessive blood loss. Wait a minute, the lady's young husband suddenly spoke up, his face filled with confusion, his voice shrill. Something's not right here, is it? Interrupted. Draco smiled slightly, pipe in hand, and turned to the other man. Please speak up. Looking at the enthusiastic lady beside him and the various expressions on their faces, the pale-faced young husband struggled to breathe. I can't really say anything. Your reasoning just now sounded quite convincing, but there are 2 victims in this room. According to your explanation, how did this captain, who was also stabbed in the throat and suffocated, end up in the room?" As soon as he finished speaking, all 5 eyes turned to Draco, awaiting his answer. Very good, without hesitation or doubt, a mysterious emotion appeared on Draco's smiling face. "Congratulations, brave sir, you've discovered the first crucial blind spot on this case. Please give me a reward, please vote." Chapter 72 Train Murder Case. 1 minute. "I'm only giving you 1 minute," a sweating guard soldier, pistol raised, his trembling eyes straining to avoid looking at the gruesome corpses on the ground, roared at the bullet-riddled, blood-stained door of the private room. "Get out here in 1 minute, or I'll fucking shoot." Anson was already surrounded. Realizing they only had one enemy, these elite guards, far superior to the draft scum, decisively chose a 2-pronged attack: 2 to block the corridor, 2 to block the front and back private rooms, 1 to block the door, and 1 to provide flank cover. With sufficient preparation, numbers were an overwhelming advantage. Even the best soldier could be sent to his death with a single bullet. Of course, some monsters were an exception. Anson, inwardly cursing, sat on the floor of the private room, loading bullets one by one into the magazine of his revolver, counting silently. 5, the tense guard soldier shouted, his right thumb gripping the hammer. 4, Anson, his magazine full of ammunition, picked up a revolver from the corpse of a guard in the compartment. 3, the 2 guards outside the door exchanged a glance and slowly rose. 2, with a flourish of his guns, Anson rose without hesitation, facing the compartment door, his sidearms pointing to either side. 1. Bang! Draco, standing in front of the door, suddenly banged his pipe on it, startling the 5 men who were focused on their work. In the very last compartment of carriage number 12, a first-class compartment with only 1 passenger, 2 victims were found dead at the same time, and even their methods of death were extremely similar. This murder case, seemingly shrouded in mystery and completely incomprehensible in its cause, actually revealed the truth to us the moment we entered. Draco turned his head, feigning confidence as he looked at the puzzled crowd. The key to the mystery lies in the identities of the 2 men. Identities. In the ensuing silence, the elderly nobleman wearing a top hat spoke first, his slightly hoarse voice filled with caution. "You mean this unfortunate case was caused by the identities of the 2 men?" Draco, pipe in hand, smiled slightly, not directly answering his question, but instead walking between the 2 corpses, his lowered gaze first falling on the captain on his right. "First, there's this guard's captain, in his 30s, unmarried, frugal, and hard-working. His cheeks, knuckles, and forearms bear scars, and his uniform shows obvious signs of washing. Even though guards officers receive clothing and travel allowances 4 times a year, his skin and physique show clear signs of alcoholism, and combined with his injuries, my assessment is that he's an officer who has struggled for years without promotion, lives alone, and spends most of his salary and allowances on medical treatment, wound care, and drinking." Draco spoke rapidly, his lowered gaze shifting to the left before anyone could react. "As for this respectable gentleman, his cane sword is very unique. The handle is made of silver-plated ebony, and the steel blade inside is sharp, not from an ordinary forge, but from a military workshop. Using such a weapon proves that this gentleman also comes from the military, and is very likely a high-ranking officer, either in the past or still is. His strong physique under his coat and his ability to fight the murderer further confirm this." The 2 men were of similar status, similar age, and even their time and method of death were almost identical. Draco slowly raised his head, a meaningful glint in his eyes, and the whole unfortunate incident began when this wealthy and respectable gentleman, while smoking his pipe, heard someone outside and, for some reason we don't know, carelessly opened the door to the private room. So, what could it be? The smiling novelist deliberately lured silence. In the deathly atmosphere of the private room, the people, their faces either grave, hesitant, or confused, fell into deep thought. Several minutes later, the still shaken waiter suddenly raised his right hand tremblingly and murmured in an extremely uncertain tone, because they knew each other. Everyone looked up, waiting for Draco's answer. They had somehow become accustomed to this method of solving the case, a method that subtly revealed the truth. This time, the novelist deliberately didn't give an immediate answer. Instead, he pondered for a long time until everyone began to show signs of impatience before solemnly nodding. "I think this is highly likely, but that raises another question." "What question?" The train conductor, who had just looked grim, was now more eager to know the answer than anyone else. A poor guards captain appeared outside the first-class compartment. A respectable gentleman of similar age and acquaintance opened the door for him. Several hours later, both the men were found dead in the locked compartment. Until this helpful waiter opened the door, Draco turned around, his face grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we are very close to the truth of this case. This is a case of premeditated extortion and accidental murder." The crowd reacted with varying expressions. Some screamed, some gasped, but none showed any surprise. In fact, after following Draco through the case-solving process, they could already imagine the part of the story the novelist hadn't told them. A poor, frustrated low-ranking officer, through some means, learns that a former colleague of noble birth is on the Iron Sky, so he tries to sneak onto the train. After his attempt to extort money fails, jealousy and inferiority drive him to murder. Ultimately, without anyone noticing, the two fight and die together. But to definitively close the case, one crucial piece of evidence is missing. Draco interrupted the other speculations, speaking softly as he walked towards the compartment door, puffing on his cigarette. A respectable gentleman from the army like this usually has no shortage of guards, and this captain certainly understands that if he can't eliminate the gentleman's guards, even if he succeeds in extorting money, he won't be able to escape from the Iron Sky, so he must have made preparations. "Gentlemen, this is the key to the final verdict." Bang! The instant the gunshot rang out, the astonished guards vaguely heard their comrades' screams. The guards at the front of the carriage had vanished. Seizing the momentary lapse in concentration on the enemy's face, Anson in the compartment opened fire simultaneously on both sides, instantly emptying his ammunition. The thin walls of the second-class compartment were no match for the power of the revolver, and he took down two more soldiers lying in ambush in the compartments before and after him. After confirming that the enemy was dead, Anson decisively discarded his empty pistol and kicked the door open. Thump! The soldier was slammed against the wall of the carriage aisle by the door he had just kicked open, watching in panic as one of his comrades was shot through the head by a bullet that seemed to have come from nowhere. The next second, a figure rushed out of the door and appeared behind him, forcefully pulling his right hand and firing at his comrade at the other end. 6 bullets were fired in an instant, and the soldier, spraying blood, lost his footing and fell from the carriage's connecting section. The desperate soldier struggled desperately, but Anson behind him twisted off his right hand that was holding the gun and forcefully pulled him around again. The last thing he saw was a young girl in an old military uniform, holding a Bernier rifle, grinning at him from outside an entire carriage. Bang! A loud crash followed, and a panting waiter pushed through the crowded corridor, bursting open the door and looking at the people in the compartment with a horrified expression. "Found it. Carriage 8, there are gunshot wounds and corpses everywhere. Those people, it seems they all died together." The moment the words left his mouth, the previously quiet corridor and room erupted in commotion, with gentlemen and ladies whispering and casting surprised or suspicious glances at Draco. The novelist, smoking a pipe, hands in his pockets, smiled calmly. "Gentlemen, ladies, congratulations, we've found the truth behind the train murders." Chapter 73 Anson's Reward. Whoosh 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 whoosh, a sharp whistle blared, accompanied by steam billowing across the entire platform. The steel sky, its bright yellow gas lamps flashing, arrived at its destination after more than 10 days of continuous travel, the Central West Station of the royal capital. As the thick fog dissipated, a surging tide of people once again engulfed the entire platform. Ragged bankrupts, their bodies stained with soot, southern nobles fleeing war, their families and suitcases piled high, wealthy merchants dressed in luxury, ready to make their mark in this new world, young gentlemen abandoning their possessions, coming to study regardless of the consequences. Group after group of people from all corners of the land, of vastly different backgrounds, abandoned their conquered fields and war-torn villages, yearning to find a new future in this greatest and most prosperous city of the Kingdom of Clovis. That's enough for now. Stepping onto the platform, Draco Veltz, a smile on his face, turned to look at Anson and Lisa, who were still standing in the carriage watching him. His right hand was tightly clutching his tattered suitcase. "Your Excellency Anson Bach, and, oh, lovely Miss Lisa Bach, it has been an honor to have shared such a fulfilling journey with you both, but even the longest journey must come to an end. To avoid pointless sadness at parting, let us say goodbye here. Are you sure?" Looking at his calm demeanor, as if nothing had happened, Anson couldn't help but raise an eyebrow. "Of course." Draco's lips curled into a slight smile. A dozen or so royal guards died inexplicably on the Iron Sky, including one whose rank and status were clearly not low. Even if they felt guilty, it was impossible for the royal guards to swallow their anger over something this serious. They should have just received the news and are heading towards the station. If you continue to get involved with a troublesome guy like me, you'll be targeted too. Anson nodded slightly. Although the newspapers were full of news about the royal guards' impending disbandment, making them seem like they were on their deathbeds, one foot in the grave, this didn't mean they were no longer a threat. Quite the opposite. The more dangerous the situation, the more reckless the royal guards became. This was an official military organization with thousands of elite soldiers, possessing the authority to move freely and make arrests throughout the capital. No matter how dangerous the situation they faced, it was still easy for them to cause trouble for a military academy graduate. Thump. Draco, smiling, suddenly released his grip on the handle, and the suitcase fell steadily to the ground. This is the payment. Looking at the undeniably heavy suitcase, Anson silently raised his gaze. We haven't even discussed this yet, and this is my answer to you. Draco shrugged. You can hide it, you can exchange it for money, or you can burn it. Those people only know I carry a suitcase with me. They don't know what it looks like. It's too common for 1 or 2 suitcases to be stolen from train platforms every day. It would be quite unusual if nothing was stolen. Draco shrugged, his sincere gaze carrying a hint of amusement. And please rest assured, I won't mention a single word about anything in the suitcase or about you, a young officer returning to the capital with a lovely girl. If asked, this is my answer, of course. Such a guarantee is practically meaningless, so if you still can't believe me, then I can only, no need to say anything more, I believe you. Suppressing the urge to roll his eyes, Anson quickly stopped the novelist who was about to continue his rambling. He knew perfectly well why he had decided to help him, and he knew his goal was the intelligence the Thunder Fortress conscripted soldiers possessed that suggested they were affiliated with the old gods, but he hadn't mentioned it once. He'd even thrown all the intelligence he'd gathered at him to allay his concerns. Anson sighed inwardly, his feelings slightly complicated. He really wasn't used to this guy who could perceive other people's thoughts just by observing them. Interrupted, Draco smiled slightly, his right hand in his pocket pulling out several postcards, folding them into a stack, and gently placing them next to the handle of his worn leather suitcase. You mentioned before that you returned to the capital for your graduation certificate from the Royal Military Academy. I probably can't help you with that, but in the meantime, you'll definitely need to rent a reasonably priced, conveniently located, and comfortable place. A place? Anson was slightly taken aback, a little confused by the guy's tone. That's right. Although you don't seem to be short of money, I guess you probably won't choose to stay in a hotel, will you? Draco asked with a smile. If that's the case, I advise you to give up that idea. Chloe City is not what it was a year ago. The prices of hotels and inns near the station have increased tenfold, and even a lieutenant colonel's allowance would be hard to afford. He even guessed his rank. Anson, without changing his expression, resisted the urge to reach for his sidearm on his hip again. Besides, you're not alone now. You have our lovely yet terrifying, the one who's good at surprising people, Miss Lisa. It's really too much to let a young girl still in her innocent years live in a mere 20 square meter guest room, Draco continued with a smile. These postcards have the contact information of several reputable landlords. A kind old nobleman gave them to me before I got off the train. Unfortunately, I already have a place to stay in the capital, so obviously you need these more than I do right now. Oh, by the way, if you're feeling well off, I highly recommend you check out that house near White Lake Park. Convenient transportation, only 3 intersections away from the red brick street where Clovis Cathedral is located, and the tenants and residents have their own security company, so the security is quite good. Besides, it's fully furnished, from the fireplace to the kitchen, bathroom, and most of the furniture. The only problem is that you have to pay at least 6 months to a year's rent up front, plus the security company's fees. So it's perfect for someone with a large sum of cash, and his relationship with the Church of Order. What else doesn't he know about this guy? Finally, I wish you both a smooth journey in the capital. I have a feeling we'll meet again soon. Hopefully, by then, we'll have both accomplished what we wanted to do. With that, Draco smiled, lit his pipe again, and turned to leave with the surging crowd. Anson, stepping onto the cold platform, gently picked up the suitcase Draco had tossed aside. Looking up again, Draco had vanished into the throng, leaving only a vague silhouette, a figure in a worn coat, smoking a pipe. A forlorn figure. Chapter 74 New Things in the Royal Capital. After saying goodbye to a novelist, Anson, accompanied by Lisa, deliberately lingered on the platform for another 10 minutes before leaving the Central West station of the Royal Capital with a gradually thinning crowd. Beep. Beep. Almost simultaneously with the two stepping out of the station gates, a sharp, piercing siren suddenly exploded in the bustling street. The Royal Guard. The Royal Guard is here. A terrified scream suddenly rang out outside the gates, and the crowd on the street immediately erupted into chaos, making the narrow avenue, wide enough for 6 carriages to pass side by side, incredibly congested. Those carrying luggage, haggling with drivers, and those still trying to understand what was happening, everyone was instantly caught up in the sudden panic, pushing and shoving to avoid the approaching siren. In the chaos, gentlemen lost their hats and luggage, children who couldn't find their families or parents sat on the ground crying, and charming young ladies and elegant noblewomen competed in high-pitched singing. Everyone was like a headless fly, desperately trying to escape the commotion. Squeezing through the throng, the unhurried Anson managed to flag down a taxi before it could flee to Clovis Cathedral. "I'm so sorry, but you'd better find someone else." The hurried coachman, sweating profusely, was about to run away when he noticed a small hand on his reins. Turning around, he saw a sweet, innocent little girl had somehow climbed onto the carriage, smiling at him with 2 large suitcases. 12 coppers, the coachman, now cheated, gritted his teeth and demanded a high price. 8. The guards across the street were already sirens blaring and gunfire clearing the crowd, but Anson, unfazed, bargained earnestly, "It should only be 4 streets from here to Red Brick Street, right? I don't think it's worth that much. By the ring of order, could you perhaps change the carriage?" The coachman was sweating profusely, desperately trying to pull on the reins, but found the little girl's hands locked to them, unmoving. "Fine. For the child's sake, 10 coppers. That's the lowest I can go. Any lower and you might as well just take my carriage." "Deal." Anson nodded decisively and immediately got into the carriage. The hurried coachman immediately yanked the reins, urging the carriage away without even asking for payment. Under the blazing midday sun, the carriage sped along the street. The driver, intimately familiar with the area, first weaved through narrow alleys between houses to the opposite side of the street, then quickly traversed a dilapidated market district. Only after confirming several times that he could no longer hear the steam train station did he finally slow down. "Excuse me, are the Royal Guards of the capital really that terrifying?" Anson asked curiously, looking at the driver's relieved expression. "Terrible? The coachman chuckled, speaking with the tone of a coachman looking at a stranger. "Sir, is this your first time in Clovis?" "Second time," Anson replied casually. "Last time I came, the kingdom and the empire hadn't gone to war yet, and the Royal Guard wasn't like this." "That's right." The coachman had an "I knew it" look on his face. "You've been gone too long. Clovis isn't what it used to be. Thieves used to only dare to roam the streets, but now they rob people on the highways. Factory workers toil day and night, then rob drunkards and homeless people with hammers and shovels. Security company owners become gangsters after dark, and there's nowhere they wouldn't dare to rob except military camps. But all the gangsters and robbers are no match for the Royal Guard." The coachman suddenly changed the subject. "Because in the entire Clovis, only they dare to rob openly, so the Royal Guard's discipline has deteriorated to the point of robbing people in the streets." Anson thought to himself. Of course, this could also be a strategy. By deliberately relaxing military discipline and condoning looting, they could make the Privy Council understand the consequences of disbanding the guards, and use this to blackmail them into delaying or abandoning the City Public Management Act. The advantage of this approach is its obvious effectiveness, but the disadvantage is that it would severely affect the morale of the army. Once disciplined soldiers suddenly lose control, it would be impossible to reinstate them. But facing a guards unit that would dare to carry out even a spur-of-the-moment idea like the train robbery, Anson seriously doubted whether they could even think of this. They wouldn't have dared to do this before. Back then, there were 20 or 30,000 troops stationed in Clovis. It wasn't until the kingdom and the empire went to war and troops were transferred away one after another that they started to become arrogant. If this were before, how could the Privy Council have been so polite to these scum? The coachman said indignantly. "You know the Privy Council?" Anson asked with some surprise. "Of course I know. That's the highest authority in the kingdom of Clovis, the place where you submit bills to the king, set taxes, and execute administrative orders. Every citizen of the kingdom should know this," the coachman said matter-of-factly, even asking Anson, "Young man, don't you usually read the newspaper?" I just got back." "Well, our newspaper's starting to talk about this stuff now." "Not entirely, but the Clovis Truth Daily does." The coachman became more and more excited. "It's a good newspaper. It has everything. There's a young man in the tavern near my house who reads it to the customers for a fee. I listen to it every issue." Anson, recalling a novelist and second-rate detective's evaluation of this newspaper, he suddenly had the realization that there's nothing new under the sun. Some things, even if the world and era change, will never disappear as long as there are still people who like things that have nothing to do with them. 20 minutes later, the carriage slowly stopped in front of the Clovis Cathedral on the red brick street. Carrying a suitcase in one hand and holding Lisa's hand in the other, she slowly stepped down from the carriage and walked up the marble steps towards the magnificent church before her. The Clovis Cathedral, situated on the red brick street, is one of the oldest and most modern buildings in the capital. It was built 200 years before the founding of the Kingdom of Clovis and underwent continuous renovations and expansions over the following centuries. While preserving numerous historical traces, the cathedral itself has evolved from a single church into a complex of buildings scattered throughout the red brick street. The cathedral, over 150 meters long and boasting 5 towers, is the newest of these buildings. Its massive bell tower, soaring into the sky, is a pinnacle of architectural achievement for its time. Lisa, standing beneath the church doors, stared wide-eyed at the towering structure whose top was impossible to see, exclaiming in astonishment, "Anson, what is this place?" "This is the cathedral," Anson explained, his expression somewhat complicated. "It's a place for offerings and praying to the Ring of Order." "Oh," Lisa nodded earnestly, as if she truly understood. "So, are we here today also to pray to the Ring of Order?" "No, our purpose today has nothing to do with the Ring of Order," Anson shook his head. "We're here to collect money." Chapter 75 Bank. For Anson, the Order Church and its churches from his pre-Anson memories were probably the most difficult things for him to understand at first. In the 243rd year of the Saints' calendar, to cope with the massive losses of the war, the Order Church officially incorporated the private banks of the Archbishop and several bishops into the church, granting them the right to lend and mint coins. Gold coins inscribed with the original text and the Ring of Order, silver coins of the saints, and copper coins of the Archbishop were issued on a large scale for the first time. The continuous war led the church to develop an extremely sophisticated financial system, even extending into hostile forces, providing services such as savings, loans, and tax collection. In the 47th year of the Saints' calendar, the newly appointed Archbishop, in order to unify the Order Church, convened the Second Order Council, accepting all the conditions proposed in the 22nd year of the Saints' calendar. The Order Church maintained neutrality, no longer interfering in the internal affairs of other nations, and established banks and church academies in the capitals and important cities of various kingdoms. Now, in the 100th year of the Saints' calendar, the Order Church, as the spiritual leader of the Order world, has long since transcended the spiritual realm. For example, the stipend accounts of mid to low-ranking officers like Anson were almost all registered under the name of the Church of Order. When it came to large-scale trade, huge loans, and asset management and guarantees, most wealthy merchants and nobles preferred to trust the church's reputation rather than the private banks of competitors or hostile forces. Furthermore, a single word from Luther Franz, Archbishop of Clovis and father of the conscription commander-in-chief Ludwig, carried far more weight than the Privy Council's Minister of Finance or the head of the Royal Bank. Walking on the smooth, mirror-like marble tiles, bright fiber optics shone through the stained glass windows on either side, illuminating the towering, massive columns and creating overlapping light and shadow in the narrow interior. The gentle chimes from outside further enhanced the sacredness of this interplay of light and shadow. So, who would have thought this was actually a bank? Anson, inwardly grumbling, led Lisa through the gate carved with the Ring of Order, into the elegantly decorated and solemn waiting room, and found a seat near the front. Perhaps because of the riot a month ago, the entire church seemed deserted. Even Lisa seemed to be affected by the quiet atmosphere, her eyes wide, her legs tucked into her chair, barely daring to breathe. 10 minutes later, a clear bell rang through the empty walls. A gentleman wearing a top hat, carrying a cane and a newspaper, rose from behind the counter, nodding to Anson as he passed. Anson smiled slightly at him and immediately stood up. "Hello, how can I help you?" The receptionist was a nun in a black and white robe, a badge of the Ring of Order hanging on her slightly heaving chest, her smile sweet. "I'm an army officer. I'm here to collect my allowance for this month." Perhaps because of the atmosphere, Anson found his tone softening to match hers. "No problem," the nun nodded and smiled. "Please show me your identification and proof of account." Anson pulled out a slightly old but perfectly wrinkled card bearing the Bach family crest from his coat pocket and handed it to the nun through the crack in the counter. "Do you have VIP status at this church?" The nun checked the card and smiled at Anson again. I don't think so." Anson continued to smile. "I'm just here to collect my allowance. Do you have any financial planning or investment plans?" "I'm just here to collect my allowance." "Do you need any insurance or small loans?" "I'm just here to collect my allowance." "No problem." The nun smiled sweetly. "What is your name?" "The one you're holding." Anson continued to smile. "Anson Bach." The nun nodded decisively, deftly drawing a blank document from a stack beside her, her nimble handwriting leaving a string of elegant characters. "What is your reason for applying for this allowance, Anson?" "I'll fill in no reason for you." After a moment of silence, the young nun stood up and said very kindly, "Your application needs to be reported and reviewed. Please wait a moment, it will only take 10 minutes. Anson's smile had completely frozen. 10 minutes later, the nun who had been conversing with a priest ran back to the counter, her arched eyebrows showing regret as she looked at Anson. "Respected Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, I'm very sorry. There's a small problem with your officer's allowance account." "What is it?" "It's like this. Although your rank has now changed from captain to lieutenant colonel, the army hasn't sent the relevant documents to the Church of Order, so unless you can go to the army to obtain the relevant certificate, we cannot provide you with a lieutenant colonel's allowance." Anson nodded. This situation was within his expectations. After all, he had been promoted on the spot by Ludwig, and it was normal for the army, which had a poor relationship with the church, to be unwilling to provide him with the necessary documents. "It's all right, just keep my original rank." The captain's allowance in the Kingdom of Clovis was less than half that of a lieutenant colonel, barely enough for one person to live in a big city like the capital, but if Lisa were added, the daily expenses and necessary social interactions for two people would be quite tight. "If it's only temporary, I wouldn't mind accepting it. I'm very sorry, but this won't work either." The nun's face showed a troubled expression again. "Although your allowance account remains the same as before, your current rank is lieutenant colonel. According to the agreement between the Army and the Church of Order, the allowance accounts for junior and mid-ranking officers belong to two completely separate systems. So, I regret to inform you, Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, that you can no longer receive the junior officer's allowance unless you can obtain a formal document from the Army and submit it outside of prior days and working hours. We will send you a reply within 7 to 30 working days." After speaking, the smiling nun looked at Anson with sincere eyes. "Is there anything else we can do to help you? Clovis Cathedral is willing to provide the best possible assistance to every believer in the Ring of Order." After a few seconds of silence, Anson, whose expression remained stiff, forced a smile and softly asked, Any help? Any help?" The nun nodded sincerely. "What if I need to cash a check?" "Of course, no problem. Clovis Cathedral is happy to provide you with personal cash services." The nun smiled. "How much would you like to cash?" 1,000 gold coins." Just as Anson left, a young priest's astonished voice rang out from inside the church. "That army lieutenant colonel cashed 1,000 gold coins, and it's a bearer check, with only the church's seal and signature on it." The nun nodded frantically, her expression even more surprised than his. "By the Ring of Order," the young priest exclaimed again, but then a puzzled look appeared on his face. But why did he look so gloomy when he left? By the Ring of Order, how could that be? The nun was equally puzzled. "Every word I said, every expression I made, was strictly in accordance with the church's regulations." According to the regulations, he should have been very satisfied, so what made him look so grim? The troubled nun and the priest frowned in the same way. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.